I've been in construction my whole working life. I started straight out of school 10 years ago, and I've spent much of that time on the move. Not a lot of people know this, but when the job ends, craft workers are mostly laid off. Pipe fitters, carpenters, crane operators, all gone. That means we need to pick up our tools and head to a different job site, hoping to get hired back on. Since the money's good, that's what I do. It's the life I've always known. Every few years, I just travel from one side of the country to the other, hoping to find work. After my last job ended, which was about a week ago, I received word from my old boss that his oil company was hiring. He said that since I was a good worker, I was just hired. Just show up and get to work. Told him to give me a few days and I'll be there as soon as I could. As for the location, it was in some small town out in Illinois called Brookfield. I'd never heard of the place before, but that was nothing new. Most plants are built in the middle of nowhere. This is in case they explode. The loss of life will be minimal compared to the same disaster in a city. The next morning, I packed up my stuff and started driving. On the road, I called and spoke to some guy named Trevor over the phone. I'd found him on Craigslist. He was renting a room and the price was about what I wanted to pay. "Ha, I'd love to have you." Through the phone, his voice sounded jovial. "I'll get some clean sheets on that bed and an extra set of blankets. It gets a little chilly this time of year." "Oh, sir, thank you so much. I'll see you when I get there," I said. After driving for about 10 hours, I finally arrived at Brookfield, and it was nothing like how I expected. I've been to some rundown towns before, but this one right here. Their downtown could have easily been made into a setting for The Walking Dead. Most of the buildings I drove past looked either abandoned or half demolished. Some had girders sticking out of the sides like exposed ribs. Electric poles lay broken in the streets. One place that might have once been a gift shop looked like it had just burned down the night before. Parts of the blackened wood were still smouldering. The only building I saw that were intact were a police station and a Waffle House. Also, directly in the center of the town, there was a random graveyard. Not the sort with a freshly mowed lawn and neat tombstones set at regular intervals. This one had crosses, the kind made from 2 sticks roped together, buried in the muddy soil. Mounds of dirt sat next to freshly dug graves. Trees, their limbs twisted and gnarled, were scattered throughout the area, casting misshapen shadows. One of them even had a noose hanging from one of its branches. It swayed gently back and forth. I couldn't help but wonder if some kids had put it up there as some sort of sick joke, or if it was meant as a threat. A threat for whom, I had no idea. Swallowing around the tightness in my throat, I continued on, followed the GPS on my phone, and arrived at the place listed. Trevor was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a handwritten note taped to the door. It read, "Sam, sorry I couldn't be there. Something came up out of town that I gotta take care of. Just hold on to the rent for a few days. I'll collect it as soon as I get back. Keys in the potted plant. Head on in and make yourself at home. Trevor." There was an arrow at the bottom, drawn in Sharpie, pointing down and to the left. I wouldn't exactly have called the object beneath a potted plant. More accurately, I would have said that it was a pot of dusty soil with cobwebbed and a small bare branch sticking out of the center. I jerked a shoulder, dug the key out of the dirt, and did as the paper said. The next morning, as I made myself a pot of coffee in the kitchen, I found myself studying the pictures on the wall and the elderly gentleman who featured in a number of them. I assumed this was Trevor. In one picture, he was fishing. In another, he was at a family function swinging at a piñata. He had a kind face, smiling in every photograph. I thought that once I met the guy, we'd probably get along nicely. After pouring my cup of joe, I headed outside, ready to leave for work, when I saw something on my windshield. There was an envelope placed under my wiper. Confused, I collected the envelope, pulled the paper out and read it. It said I'd been fined $100. Literally, it said, "You have been fined $100. No explanation." What's more, it was written on a normal sheet of wide rule, loose leaf paper in red crayon. Listed on the bottom of the paper was an address where I was supposed to mail the cash, check, or money order. What the hell was this? I thought to myself, flipping the paper over and inspecting the back. It had to be a prank, right? So, I did what anybody would have done. I shrugged and tossed it in the back seat where it landed on the floorboard. Then I went to my new job site where I worked as a crane operator. Most of the day I was up in the cab transporting steel. It's a hard, lonely life, but I was okay with that. It was good money. I didn't even mind the fact that I didn't get toilet breaks. I'd just carry a bottle. High up in the cab, I saw the other craft workers milling about, doing their jobs. Flagging, sanding, and pipe laying. Since it took me 30 minutes to climb out of the crane, most were already gone home by the time I got down. As for that odd note, I wanted to mention it to my old boss, ask him if he'd ever heard of it, but it seemed like he hadn't come in that day. So I just got on with things, finished for the day, and went home. The following morning, I went out to my car. All of the windows had been busted out. The windshield looked like somebody had taken a sledgehammer to it. To say that I was furious is an understatement. "What the hell?" I said to no one, throwing my arms wide, approaching my vehicle. Once again, placed under the wiper was another envelope. This one read, "Warning, fine is now $200. Pay, or you will be sent home." Of all the things I've been through in my life, this was probably the weirdest. Especially bizarre that I hadn't heard the glass shatter last night. Surely, I thought, I would have heard it, considering I was a light sleeper and my bedroom window was only a few feet from my car. Fueled with anger, I crumpled up the letter. I wanted to blame Trevor for this, but the guy hadn't come back home yet. I was the only one here last night, so if it wasn't him, then who was leaving these fines? Still mad, I removed what was left of the windshield, got in my car, and drove to the address listed on the sheet. In my opinion, this type of behavior warranted an ass whooping, and I was ready to give it. But when I got to the location, it was not exactly what I'd been expecting. It was the damn graveyard in the center of town. My blood chilled as I slowed the car to a stop. The eeriness of the situation made the hair on my arms stand on end and a twinge of nausea twist in my gut. I didn't know what to do, so I stared through the emptiness where my windshield would have been for a few minutes, gaze wandering across the grave markers. Eventually, I got myself together. The police station was across the street, so that was where I went. It was convenient, considering I needed to fill out a police report to file to my insurance anyway. Inside the station, I found a fit, middle-aged police officer standing behind a wooden desk. The officer typed away at his computer. "How can I help you?" I put the envelope down on the desk. "Yeah, well, I got this fine and..." Silence fell across the entire police station. Behind him, every head in the room swiveled in my direction. Concern coloured all their faces. Some huffed out worried breaths, others quickly returned their attention to their papers, scribbling fast, avoiding eye contact with me. One guy looked angry, like he wanted to kick my ass. The officer swallowed. Where did you find this exactly?" "Somebody left it on my car." His eyes widened as some type of realization flashed across his face. His hand bounced, knocking on the wood. "What is it?" I asked, feeling my heart rate elevate. That nausea surged again. He cleared his throat. He patted the envelope on the desk and slid it back to me. "What is your name, son?" he asked. Sam Chavez." He nodded. "Well, Sam, I'm going to need you to pay this." "What? You're going to have to pay this? I don't understand." The man leaned forward with a hard stare. His hand landed on his gun. "Is there a problem here?" "What the hell?" I thought. I swallowed, trying to regain my composure. "Well, can I just give you the cash then?" "No," he said. I was so lost. "Well, why the hell not?" "Because you have to mail it in." "What? You getting loud with me, boy?" I blinked. "Huh?" "Pay the fine. Now get the hell out of here before I put you behind bars. Are we clear?" Leaving the police station, I was so confused. I was actually scratching the back of my head. This was so insane that I didn't know what else to do. I needed something, answers or anything, or at least to find out who was doing this. I tried calling my old boss to ask him for some advice. No answer. I even tried calling Trevor. Same. So I drove 50 miles out of town and stopped at a Walmart. There, I picked up an outdoor Nest camera and then headed back to my place. After setting up the camera, I installed the app on my phone and paid the subscription service to actively record all movements. Then, I fell asleep. That night, around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed, alerting me that there was motion outside. Half awake, I clicked open the app and saw a truck pull to stop in the driveway. I recognized the man who got out from the pictures I'd seen, so I knew it was Trevor. He slammed his door and made his way into the house. I considered talking to him, introducing myself, but the guy was probably tired. It was 3 a.m. after all, so I closed out the app and went back to sleep. That morning, as I came out of my bedroom, I saw something in the hall that made me freeze. Blood. I was almost sure it was blood. It had that smell. A trail of splatters led to the kitchen. I followed. There, I found Trevor. He was lying on the kitchen counter, chest cracked open like an alien had burst out of it. Ribs spread, viscera scattered all over the tile and sink. His face was twisted in horror, his mouth wide open, his lips stretched in a silent howl of agony. In his hand was an envelope that I was all too familiar with. For some reason, it was the cleanest thing in the kitchen. There wasn't a speck of blood on it. The letter hung down low, angled so that the wording faced me. It read, "This is the cost." Fighting either a panic attack or a nervous breakdown, I staggered back and threw up on the floor. I sucked in a huge breath, trying to force myself to calm down, but I couldn't hold it against the next rush of vomit, and I spewed the rest of my dinner onto the kitchen floor. Coughing and gasping, I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and scrambled away from the body. After gathering what little rationality I had left, I fished my phone out of my pocket and dialed those 3 numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Said a lady on the opposite end of the line. I took a deep breath. The air still smelled of blood and vomit. Hi, my roommate, he's dead. What's the address? 212 Silver Lake Drive, a man is dead. Her voice sounded terse, maybe even annoyed. Yes, how did you... This is why you pay the damn fine, she said. Click. So I did. I mailed in a check that night and got the hell out of Dodge. I'm used to living on the move, but I've never packed up so quickly. I left the body just lying there as I cleared out. Someone else's problem. I'd had enough of this. Screw that creepy-ass town, the job, and that damn graveyard. I drove all night, heading for my parents' house, where I knew they had my old bedroom waiting. I didn't want to wake them, so when I got there, I used my spare key to let myself in. Something was waiting for me at my old bedroom door. My blood froze. Scotch taped to the wood was a note. Same familiar handwriting, same red crayon, and I realized that maybe I'd made a mistake. All along, the note had been delivered to Trevor's house. Trevor had been the one to die. Perhaps whoever, whatever had sent those vines, they hadn't meant any of it for me. But now I had their attention. The note read, "Who are you?" Numbly, I pushed the door open. I was just tired. I didn't know what to do, what the hell I'd gotten myself into. I had the idea that I could just collapse into bed, figure something out later. Inside, the walls, the bed, the desk, all of them were plastered with hundreds of white rule, loose-leaf paper. "Who are you?" they demanded. "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" February 22nd, 2022. This is the date I chose to end things. I figured the date would look cool in an obituary. I have 2 middle names and a double-barreled last name. Maybe someone looking in the papers would think it was a sign or something. All my affairs were in order. I'd sufficiently given up. I was ready. The last few years have been hell for me. My already dwindling social life was completely shut down during the shutdown. My job finally figured out I wasn't actually any use, and my roommate went on to do bigger and better things. So there I was, left alone in an apartment I couldn't afford, with a life that had nothing going on. Now, don't get me wrong, I tried, I really did, but life always threw a curveball when I was swinging straight. My last decision now is, how do I do it? What's the way I want to go? My perfect idea was the lake by the hills. Near a main road, not too far from my old house, sits a beautiful lake, one that is surrounded by some grassy hills with small roads that take you into town. The other side is a beautiful front where families gather in the good weather. If you looked at it and said it looks straight out of a catalogue, that's because it is. It was on the cover of the catalogue the estate agent used for the house I'd bought with my fiancée, soon-to-be wife. Her name was Lucy, and we were meant to spend the rest of our lives together. For months, we'd saved up to move into a house together. The only issue we had was where. We met at uni and loved the sea, and for a long while, we were happy there. However, as the years passed, we started to grow out of what we found fun. The noise that we used to be a part of began to grate on us. The activities moved way too fast for us. We were growing up. Once we realized that we were in the settling phase, that we'd outgrown the student-rich area of our life, we decided to leave the nest. When we found the house in the town near the lake, we did everything we could to get it. We both worked doubles to build up just enough for the deposit. We borrowed help to move. When we were handed the keys, we worked hard to move in as fast as possible. The moving arrangement was simple. Because we were moving from an apartment to a small house, we didn't have heaps of stuff. We had 2 friends that had small trucks that we borrowed, and our idea was to split up and move amounts each until we were done. This is where we had a split in opinion. She wanted to keep the loads minimal, make several trips, and get it done over the course of a few days. But to me, I wanted to get it done as soon as possible. It was a 4-hour drive each way, so to keep going back and forth was a mind-numbing thought. I figured out that with enough straps we could load all of our stuff on both trucks with the seats filled to the brim, and we could do it in one trip. My synapses were firing off at the idea of moving in one go. Always the cautious planner, Lucy was apprehensive, but when I presented her with the idea that she does her half in 2 trips, she gave in and agreed to do it my way. The winter wasn't very harsh in our apartment area, but I didn't realize how bad it was around the area we were moving to. Some of the rural roads gave me a bit of trouble, the weight of our stuff not helping with the sharper turns that you never run into when driving in the city. There were a few close calls, but eventually I made it to the house. I got there first, which was worth a gloating text. I waited for Lucy to arrive. During the first hour, I figured she'd pulled over at a shopping area. There's a reason I called her a leaky tap with the number of bathroom breaks she took. After the second hour, I thought she might have been taking the road slow to avoid an accident. When 3 hours hit, I started to grow worried. None of my calls went through, and my texts were left unread. I didn't know if this warranted a call to the emergency services, so I was stuck in a limbo of not knowing what to do. All the while, the weather was ever getting worse. After 5 hours, I couldn't wait any longer and decided to call the police. I let them know of the situation, and they told me they'd keep me updated if they found anything. Then, all I could do was have a restless sleep alone in the cold new house. The day after, I looked outside, and my heart sank. Nothing. I was at a loss at what to do. I called my friends who lent us the trucks, and they said they hadn't heard anything from Lucy. I inquired with the police to see if there was an update, and they simply told me that if I wasn't contacted, then no. I tried to go about my business as usual, but my mind was fogged up with worry and anxiety. A whole day went past, and nothing came about. On the second day, I received a call. It was the police. They found her. A farmer took his tractor down some of the small rural roads just outside of town. Because he was driving slow enough, he noticed some red scrape marks on the edge of the road. This particular turn had a small bank that led towards the lake. Usually, there was a small barrier that you couldn't see due to the thin layer of snow, but when the farmer kicked the snow away, he realized it was gone. Once he let the police know, they immediately investigated and saw what happened. Lucy must have hit a patch of ice and gone through the barrier. They found the truck crumpled at the bottom near the lake. Lucy must have survived the tumble because she was found a ways away from the vehicle and crawled slowly out of the crash. However, she didn't make it far in the harsh cold of winter. The authorities determined that the truck was too top-heavy, and though she reacted in time, the weight pulled her too hard and took her over the edge. The barrier could have stopped her, but it snapped under the weight of the load. I had lost her, and it was my fault. Can life carry on after this? This was a question I contemplated alone, in a house I could no longer afford, with a mix of half our stuff. Sure, I made a bad call, but it was from good intentions. If a higher being was watching, this was far too harsh a punishment. Let me off with a warning, hurt us, break our stuff, take me. But why her? It didn't take long to default on the house. The arrangement relied on both of us working hard to keep up with the mortgage. With her gone, and me too grief-stricken to work, I was quickly kicked out. Work only tolerated so much of my tardiness before they let me go too. So much happened around that lake, and the face of what killed my wife perfectly reflected in the water. A reminder of the life I should have had. I'd arrived with some rope and heavy stones in my car. My plan was to walk in with enough weight around my waist to still move but not float. Simply walk in and let nature take its course. I pulled everything out and checked YouTube to figure out the best knots to use. This is when I heard a scream. I paused the video and made my way over, apprehensive about what was across the way. Then I heard another scream, then another, followed by giggles. It was a family having a day out by the lake. I watched, curious about what was going on. The mother sat a ways away as the kids played by the water. It was pretty cold out, so the sister screamed every time her brother splashed some of the lake water at her. She acted like she hated it, but that was overridden by how much fun she had. The father was setting up a small grill next to a cooler full of food. This sight warmed me, but soon ran cold through my blood. That should have been me. This is where I wanted to raise a family. Lucy and I should have been here, right now, grilling food with our kids, maybe a dog, laughing together to build memories that would last a lifetime. Moments talked about in graduation speeches of our kids, thanking us for the blessed upbringing we planned all those years ago. This taste sat bittersweet in my mouth. Then a voice ripped me from my thoughts. "Hey!" I jumped with a start, looking to see who it was. It was the brother, having noticed me in the shrubbery. This got the father's attention, who briefly stared at me before calling me over. At first, I wanted to refuse, but realized how weird it'd look if I was standing there, watching his family, then disappearing when caught. So I bit the inside of my cheek and made my way over. "What are you up to, bud?" he asked me. I'm parked just past the bushes. Came here by myself. Didn't expect anyone else to be here," I replied, hoping that was enough. He looked at me for a second, thinking it over, then smiled. "Not many people come to the lake this time of year. Everyone says it's too cold, but not us. We love it." "I see," I replied, letting the silence hang before feeling it to make it not awkward. "I like your family." As soon as I said this, I realized how weird it sounded, but the father chose not to take it that way. "Thank you. You know, if you came all the way out here, you're more than welcome to stay with us. There's plenty of food to go around." I tried to politely decline, but I relented after he insisted several times. So, there I was, now part of a nuclear family in the fringe of winter, having a barbecue with a pile of rocks and rope sat in my car just a few bushes over. I was introduced to everyone. There was Randall, the father. Susie was the mother. Bonnie was the daughter, and Ben was the son. They were the picturesque image of an ideal family, something that would complement the picture of the lake if another brochure was made of this area. I was riddled with small talk. We weren't familiar enough to let the silence hang, so questions were thrown about to fill the void. We went back and forth, but eventually Susie brought up the one thing I hoped no one would. "So, have anyone special in your life?" she asked with a wry smile. "It's complicated," I muttered in response. She cooed at that, just shy of an elbow nudge of wanting to know more, but I didn't want to elaborate. When she couldn't get a peep out of me, she huffed and moaned but stopped pushing. Instead, Susie and Randall went through a charade of spitting out random bits of relationship advice, hoping to land on the answer. "Something I've learned, son, is never to sit on a lie. Once they find out, it's 10 times worse than if you just told them," Randall shot out. "Never go to bed on an argument. Sort it out before you sleep. That always worked for us," Susie added. "Always have at least one date a week. Even when you're busy with kids, you have to maintain the bond you have," Randall said with joy in his voice. "Trust is the #1 thing that makes or breaks relationship. Once it goes, it's tough to get back," Susie lectured. Everything hurt. Each thing brought up would bring up pain from the past. Conversations I'd had with Lucy, our ups and downs that we fought through to make things work. We'd both made mistakes, but saw past them to still be together. Our bond was too strong. This made the loss hurt all over again. This built up until I couldn't take it much longer. Just as I was about to reach my breaking point, I heard laughing coming from the bushes. Ben and Bonnie came running out. Bonnie was swinging a rope around, while Ben was throwing a rock around. Both parents immediately went to take it from them. While they ran off, my eyes just bulged at what they'd found. They were obviously too dangerous to play with. I heard Randall asking Ben sharply where he'd found them, and all he said was, "They were in the back of the car, just past the bushes." I hoped Randall would just reprimand Ben and Bonnie for rummaging in a stranger's car, but it was worse. He inspected the rustic, ominous-looking rope, looked at the size of the rock, and immediately thought the worst. His eyes flicked to mine, and I had guilt written all over my face. There was no doubt that they were mine. But what were they for, he must have thought. Randall approached while Susie stayed with the kids, telling them to stay back. Susie watched like a hawk while Randall stepped slowly closer. I was stiff as a board and made no attempt to move. "Hey, buddy, what were those things doing in your car?" Randall cautiously asked, slowly closing the distance. In a panic, I tried coming up with a good excuse. They're not for you, if that's what you're thinking." This very much made it sound like it was for them. Randall was losing faith in me each step he took, and fear flashed in my eyes when I saw his eyes flick at the knife on the edge of the grill. This could get ugly fast. I figured now would be the best time to come clean. "They're for me," I said. With that, he stopped. "What do you mean? Why?" he asked. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "She's gone." I couldn't finish the sentence without breaking down into tears. Susie immediately came over, and they both comforted me as I explained everything. When I was done, they both just stood there in silence, thinking over my tale. Randall sat down next to me, uncomfortably close, and sighed in thought. Susie reacted like she knew what he was thinking, almost like they were having a conversation with no words. I gave them all the time in the world, which they ate up. When enough courage was built, Randall finally piped up. "Bonnie and Ben, they ain't my kids." I looked at him in surprise. Without a word from me, he continued. "Susie was married before, but wasn't happy." Susie looked away in embarrassment at her life being exposed. "I had a sweetheart, but illness took her," he carried on. "Cancer," he added as he looked into my eyes. "We met 2 years ago and hit it off at this lake on a cold February morning." They looked at each other, but their expression changed to one of adoration this time. We both came out to clear our heads with no big plan. When we both realized we were just hanging around here, we got to talking. We eventually spilled out about our lives, all the bad we were in, but realized it was something we had in common. So we agreed to meet up again and talk more, Randall said. "We realized when one story ends, a new one can start," Susie added. "Look," Randall chimed in, "we're all the protagonists of our stories, but just because a chapter has ended doesn't mean the story has. You just have to look for the next start." I just broke down and sobbed. When I finally stopped wailing, Randall looked at Susie and she nodded. For all my time since losing Lucy, I'd been trying to push hard with the life we wanted. a family-sized house, a well-paying job. This sounded like what I needed, but I never looked inward to see what I wanted. I never realized I needed to dial back and refresh my perspective. At the end of the barbecue, I said my goodbyes. I went back to my car to empty it and realized I left the stuff that the kids had taken. When I turned around, nobody was there. The grass wasn't pressed down where the grill was, and the car was gone. The air was silent with the absence of giggling and play. The smell of smoky meats was gone. I took this as my sign to leave with the message they gave me, rather than trying to figure out what had just happened. My life ended at that lake today, but my new one will start tomorrow. The final walkthrough had been going great until it was said. We were standing by the barn away from the realtors, my husband and I, along with the couple we were purchasing the property from, Ralph and Marie. I know how it sounds. You'll think I have a screw loose until you meet him yourself. The old man smiled awkwardly. Just don't speak to the wandering man. It sounds alarming, but he never gave us any trouble. Ralph looked at his wife, and she nodded quickly. Never any trouble, and we've been seeing him less and less, Marie said. When was the last time we even saw him, honey? Oh, Ralph pawed his beard. I'd say 3.5 years ago, and it had been another 2 before that. I was a little disturbed, but could tell my husband, Howard, was getting annoyed. What are you talking about? Some kind of trespasser? He said, frowning. Look, we're giving you a good deal on this place because it wouldn't feel right making a fortune selling it with these circumstances. You're safe here, and that's what matters. But there's a man that wanders these woods. Ralph stared at us gravely, and he has for some 100 years. Howard sighed obnoxiously and stared at the husband and wife, each in turn with disappointment. Anything else we should know? Ghosts in the attic, blood leaking from the walls? The couple looked at each other, embarrassed. I know it's hard to believe when we're talking like this, but we're normal folks. We're just giving you a heads up. I'll tell you what, forget this conversation until you see him. I'm a little sorry I said anything. I just wanted to save you from a fright. Will do. Howard looked up at me and didn't care to hide his growing disdain. The thing was, I liked Ralph. When we drove all the way from Boston to remote Maine to tour the property, Ralph actually looked at me where he felled his trees for firewood and explained how the hydraulic log splitter worked. Most men who owned the properties only spoke to my husband when it came to anything related to farm work. I was the ghost. Howard and I had finally reached the end of a brutal buying process to purchase our homestead in northern New England, and I could see why Howard was angry. There were no such things as ghosts to him. Now, our brand new home had some trespasser he'd be worried about. Come on, Jody, said Howard. He was already walking back to the house. I watched him over my shoulder, but stayed still. I suppose I was more prone to believe in the supernatural. Ralph took off his bald cap and rubbed his bald spot. I'm sorry, we didn't really know how to tell you this. We even thought about rehearsing. He laughed uncomfortably. But I'm deadly serious. He sighed, as if sick of coming across as a madman. When you see him, don't speak to him. You can say hello, he won't respond to that. But if you say anything else... Ralph stared fearfully into the distance as if looking upon the past. Well, don't. Just ignore him and be sure to tell him too. Ralph pointed past me to my husband's back. I nodded. Their sincerity made me want to believe them. They seemed like regular people who understood they were coming across as crazy and were ashamed of it. Thank you two, really." I shook their hands and they both smiled, relieved to be treated normally. I almost thought we were never going to find a place. Well, I don't think we could have found a lovelier couple to sell it to. Across the lawn from the barn, we could see the lake. It was autumn then, and the three of us were quiet as we watched the breeze send a brigade of birch leaves spinning into the cold water. Ralph closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "And welcome," he extended his arms. "Welcome to heaven on earth." We settled in fast. While I had a marketing job that was fully remote, Howard's job was hybrid. Every week or so, he would have to commute to Bangor to catch a connecting flight at Boston Logan, where he'd be ferried to some project around the country. He worked in engineering consultancy, and while I liked my job, he loved his. He said he didn't mind the extra commute, and I didn't mind being left alone in a house where the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Getting fast enough internet to work from the woods was the biggest hurdle, but after shelling out $200 a month for satellite, we seemed set. I suppose we weren't your average couple who moved from the city to the middle of nowhere, but it made sense. We loved nature and self-sufficiency and didn't utilize the amenities of the city. Neither of us had friends that we saw often anymore, and when it came to family, the further away they were, the better. Maybe there were signs I hadn't seen before, but it was a month after we moved in that I first noticed something was off. It was late, 11 p.m. or so, and I sat alone by a bonfire on the lake shore. Howard, already asleep inside, being the early to bed, early to rise type. I brought my wine to my lips and paused mid-sip. There, a half-mile away on the far side of the lake, a figure was strolling the shore. It was dark, but by the starlight, I was sure it was a person. I leaned forward and frowned. There were 2 other homes in the lake, but the shoreline was largely undeveloped and the woods that lined the lake were impenetrable with thick pine and aspen. Was this him, the harmless, wandering man? I changed my sip to a swig and considered. Ralph had said he'd last seen him years ago, and I thought it was strange he should make an appearance so soon. Then again, maybe this man only wandered at night, and Ralph and Marie rolled. It was likely they couldn't see very far in the dark, and how often did they sit outside at this hour? I had been having bonfires nearly nightly. It was one of the biggest reasons I'd moved out to the rural woods. You see, when I was camping as a girl, I developed a kind of addiction. An addiction to that sensation brought by the stars and the silence of the lonely vacuum of visible space. Maybe you felt it too, sitting alone at night, far from civilization, underneath stars as thick as smoke. We're faced with a nauseating sense of our insignificance. It's at night, with the universe in sight and for scale, that we can see we're barely bigger than bacteria, with lives just as brief and legacies just as remembered. I couldn't get enough of it, of the oneness, of the vulnerability that comes under the vault. Only stepping inside would break the trance. Then, when I woke the next morning, I'd wondered how I'd ever felt so small, smiling in the sunshine, assured and confident in the enormity of myself. But I had a different sensation that night. The feeling of an animal being watched. The feeling of prey. Something was wrong with how he walked, but it took me a minute to realize what it was. His steps never paused or wavered. The lake shore was not a smooth apron of rock. It was strewn with big branches of driftwood and boulders of basalt. If you were to walk it, you'd go slow as you considered your every step. I shivered then. In another few minutes, he was difficult to see, and then he turned into the woodline and disappeared into the pines entirely. "You're safe here," I remember Ralph saying. "Just don't speak to him." I was not afraid of the dark, and I wasn't going to let myself be spooked away from doing what I loved on my own property. I kept having bonfires at night, while I was determined to not let this man ruin my rural evenings. I admit, I rarely took my eyes from the opposite shore. It was a few weeks later, and beginning to get cold enough to snow, when I thoroughly began to question the safety of the woods where we lived. I'd finished splitting a quarter cord by hand. I was bent, breathing while palming my knees, when I noticed it. We had an ancient birch tree just past the woodshed, and its removal was on the to-do list as it sat dying with its bark peeling off in scrolls. But sticking out just beneath a bit of bark, something caught my eye. I squinted and walked over. With a finger, I pushed the bark back. There was a carving. I frowned. A carving. Of me. Of my face. It was a crude carving, as if done with a fingernail, but I still smiled when I saw it. My birthday was coming up, and I figured Howard had to be behind it. He was good at drawing, but I'd never heard of him carving before. The alarm bells weren't ringing then. I went inside to find him and wrapped my arms around his shoulders as he sat at his computer. "I'm very sorry, I found you surprised," I said, "but you're very sweet." I kissed his cheek, and he smiled. "What are you talking about? I found you carving out there while chopping wood." He frowned, and I didn't need to hear what he said next to know. "I never carved anything. Where?" My blood ran cold. I took my arms away from his shoulders. "On the dead birch tree." He started to stand. "What's it a carving of?" The two of us stood in the cold and stared at the tree. "This is a joke, right?" He pointed and looked at me and laughed. "Did you do this?" "No, Howard, I didn't carve it. I mean, it's not very flattering, no offense. Why is this something to joke about to you?" He said, and clicked his tongue. "You think this must be the Wandering Man, the one in the woods that kooky old couple warned us about?" "Howard, no, it's okay. I'll handle it. I think I'll give Ralph a call." He started walking away. "Howard!" "What?" "I know you're not going to take me seriously, but I've seen someone on the lake shore late at night." "You're right. I'm not going to take you seriously. So why tell me that in the first place?" "I know what those people said sounded strange, but my gut didn't tell me they were lying." "Guess what? I don't think they were lying either, but they believed crap like that and then tried to scare us the second we finally found a home. They're rude people, Jody, or at least not right in the head. And now this." He pointed at the tree. "What, did they pull a picture of you off the internet and carve this here?" "I don't think so." "Well, who did then?" Things weren't the same after that, both between me and Howard and how I felt on the property. Howard is a sweet man, but I could tell my belief in the supernatural bothered him. Deep down, it probably scared him. He was rarely impatient and condescending to me, and I was frustrated too. We couldn't afford to just try and sell this place and leave. This was our home, and I didn't want to be afraid of here either. That same Sunday, I was watching television late after Howard had gone to bed. It was a perfect night for another fire, clear and cool. But for the first time since we'd moved, I couldn't bring myself to sit outside alone. In fact, I locked the doors for the first time, and while Howard had noticed, I could tell he was relieved I'd done so and said nothing. I was developing the beginnings of paranoid habits. Every hour or so, I would look out the windows, not just the front ones either. I'd go into the kitchen, the den, the pantry, just to stare into the night. On my last round of looking out the windows that night, I turned from the diamond panes of the front door to head up to bed, but paused. I had seen something. I turned back slowly. Just beyond the black where the security light on our garage faded, a man was standing at the edge of the dark. I gasped. My first instinct was to open the door and yell, but then I remembered Ralph's warning. I threw myself up the stairs and went into our bedroom and shook Howard's foot to wake him. "Howard? I think there's someone outside. Please just come see." He sighed and rolled so his feet were on the floor. "Okay, for you." I stood on the stairs while he leaned to look out the window glass in the door. "I don't see anything." He turned back to me. "Just at the edge of the light." I stepped past him and put my eye to the glass, but there was nothing there. My shoulders sank. "He was right there," I said quietly, defeated. "Jody, I'm sorry I was snappy before, but this is what I'm so frustrated about. Those people put a creepy idea in your head, and now you're seeing what you want to see. I saw someone. I'll order a Ring doorbell tomorrow. You can put up a whole set of security cameras if you want. This is our home. We need to feel safe here. I'll do whatever it takes for you to feel that way." He tried to lay a hand on my shoulder, but I flinched away and stayed staring at the window while he went back upstairs to bed. I did order security cameras, enough for a cartel compound. Camera on the barn, camera on the garage, infrared camera to point across the lake. I was going to feel safe here. Howard was right about that. It was our home. I had to. It cost an entire paycheck, but was worth a peace of mind. However, it brought the opposite. I set up multiple monitors, moved in the coffee maker, and turned my little office into a war room. The first few nights, there was nothing. Then, the fourth night, at 2 in the morning, I saw something walking the perimeter of the property. I perked up, splashing my coffee in its cup. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, yes, yes." I was more elated than scared. I finally had this thing. Or so I thought. When I played back the footage, I cursed. The figure was just out of range of the cameras. I should have shelled out more and bought only infrared. The lights in the garage and barn weren't going to be bright enough. I still didn't share anything with Howard. While I could make out what I thought was a face and shoulder of this man walking, I knew it wouldn't be enough to convince him. Howard didn't want to believe. The footage would have to be perfect. When I first got the cameras, I forsook sleep and let my marketing work slip. I had to capture an image of this thing. I'd nearly become nocturnal, and my sleep deprivation began to scare me just as much as whatever was in those woods. I left the oven on and open, forgot my husband was home, ran the coffee maker without the pot in it. I was a mess, and I had to hit the brakes. Instead of staying up and watching live, I decided I'd fast forward the footage when I had time the next day. That night, I planned to resume my regular sleep schedule. It was around 11 p.m. when I went upstairs, and I jumped when I opened the bedroom door. Howard was mummied in the sheets. The entire long length of him was draped skin tight from head to toe. I raced over to him, but heard his steady breathing and relaxed. I thought that thing had killed him. I was losing it, I realized. I was really losing it. I took 2 Benadryl and slipped into bed. Miraculously, I slept and later woke in a fright to the bedroom door closing. But it was 4 a.m. and I realized Howard was already up to go for a run. I tossed and turned but couldn't fall back to sleep. The cameras called to me like a siren song. I threw the sheets off me and went downstairs. The house was empty. Howard's running sneakers weren't on the shoe shelf, and I knew I'd have ample time to check the footage without looking like a lunatic. I sat in my chair, but before I could rewind the footage, I froze. On the live screen, the man was staring at the front of the house as still as a street performer and more in view than he'd ever been. His clothes were thick and woolen, but his face was hidden from view. "Damn," I said aloud, suddenly realizing he was outside with this thing. "Howard!" Luckily, he brought his phone to listen to music when he ran, and I dialed him immediately. He answered on one of the latter rings. "Jody, what's going on?" "Howard," I exhaled. "Thank Christ. That man is staring at the house right now." "What? Are you safe?" "Jody, it's 4 in the morning. There's no one outside. Go back to bed." "I'm telling you, I have him on camera this time. Come back. Or no, wait until it's light out. Don't come back until it's daylight." He paused. "I think you need to go stay with your parents." "I'm safe. I'm inside. Just get back here safely when you can." "Jody." His voice was cautious now, as if I was something fragile that could be broken. "I'm out of town on a project outside of Dallas right now. Remember? Until Friday." I froze in terror as I stared at that thing on the screen. "Then who is in our bed tonight?" "What?" I let the phone fall to my lap. Howard was yelling loud enough for me to still hear, yelling about getting out of the house. But I couldn't speak anymore. It hadn't been Howard. It was the shape of that thing that I'd seen under the sheets before bed. I pictured it staring at me as I slept. I hung up and walked in a trance to the door. It was unlocked. I had sworn I locked it. I clenched my teeth in anger and threw it open. I stared at the man, and instead of just looking at the house, he was now staring back at me. "What do you want with me?" I shrieked horribly. "Leave me alone, you creep. You hear me? Leave me alone." His head began to tilt to one shoulder, tilting too far. "Oh God," I whispered. "Oh God." I'd spoken to this thing. I'd broken the only rule. I slammed the door and leaned my back against it. Suddenly, there was a horrible howling that morphed into sobs, the sobs of a grown man crying in the night. But there was something wrong with the noise. It was as if he were only mimicking emotion, like it didn't know what cries were supposed to sound like. Ralph had given me his number, and I fumbled my phone trying to find his contact. As it rang, I managed to turn towards the sound. The crying continued, but that thing was walking calmly towards the house. Its features were wrong. Its legs too long, its hands too big. Suddenly, I saw its eyes the size of tea saucers. It smiled monstrously wide, but the sobs continued. "Hello?" came a confused voice on the other line. "Ralph, it's Jody. Jody, Cope, I bought your property. It's a bit early, Jody. That thing, the man walking in the woods, he drew a picture of me. He came into my house. He's been watching me, and now I talk to him." "Oh dear," I heard him stretch. "Okay, are your doors locked?" "Uh-huh. You said it drew a picture. It carved my face into a tree." "Okay," he sighed. "I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. It ignored me and Marie." "But when you spoke to it, what happened? What's it want?" "When I asked who it was, it showed me what it really looked like, and I suppose a man isn't quite the word for it." "But what does it want?" I screamed and braved another look out the window. It was even closer now, just a few feet from the door. I ran into the living room. "I don't know," said Ralph. "I really don't. I'm sorry to say this, but..." He paused, and my heart leapt as 3 soft knocks sounded on the door. "It sounds like he likes you." "This is a bad idea." My best friend Alfie was yelling in my ear above the pounding music. "This is beyond a bad idea. This is such a bad idea that the horror movie protagonist creeping around the haunted mansion in her underwear with nothing but a flickery flashlight would stop, look you dead in the eye, and tell you that this is a stupid, terrible, horrible, bad idea." I felt some of Alfie's beer slosh down the front of my shirt. As usual, he couldn't hold his drink. We were crammed like sardines into the sticky basement of the least rundown bar in my hometown, and I'd just finished telling Alfie that I was going to a remote town in the Pyrenees Mountains to look for my father. I remember his response verbatim, because, as it turned out, I should have heeded his advice. But that came later. For the moment, I was trying to make Alfie understand that while my father hadn't disappeared, not quite, I still felt like I was owed an explanation. My father, Jamie, had been a professor of sociology, a hard-working man who always came home smelling like orange peels, chalk, dust, and desk polish. For most of my childhood, I remember him being quiet, kind, and fair. What he did to our family when I was a teenager, though, was anything but. My father's area of study was medieval witchcraft, and his views on the topic were controversial. The scholarly consensus about the thousands of witch trials that plagued Europe was that they were a result of small-town feuds, mass hysteria, hallucinogenic fungi in the food supply, or some combination of the three. My father, however, had a different opinion. He was convinced that, despite the exaggerations and persecutions, there had to be a grain of truth at the bottom of it all. His career was spent proving that a cult of witches, or at least people who believed there were witches, had really existed and persisted up to the present day. The hunt for evidence to back up such an extraordinary claim led him to obscure locales around the world, but he always came back with a lot of stories, local sweets, and a sunburn on his beaky nose until his last trip. A few days before my father was due back from Spain, almost 20 years ago now, we received a letter postmarked Madrid. In it, my father described how he'd fallen in love with his research assistant. He was moving to the mountains for a simpler life, and that, although he was very sorry, he was sure we'd understand, and that it was all for the best. The handwriting was my father's, but the message wasn't like him at all. We were all sure that something terrible had happened. The authorities involved dragged their feet, not wanting any part of a messy international domestic dispute. They responded to my mother's hysterical pleas with pity, not concern. When the local Basque authorities confirmed that my father was indeed alive and well in a small Pyrenees town, the case was closed. It might not seem fair, they told my mother, but people have a right to start over and be forgotten. After that, my hatred of my father knew no bounds. I destroyed the gifts he'd given me, changed my last name, majored in history, and dedicated my doctoral thesis to disproving any historical basis for the evidence of witchcraft. So my father had destroyed my family, I would destroy his life's work. My presentation had been a resounding success, and I was back in my hometown, hence Alfie in the bar to celebrate. My mother took advantage of my visit for some help with chores around the house, one of which was disposing of the few cardboard boxes of my father's things that we still had stuffed away in the back of the closet. I could take anything I wanted, my mother shrugged, and ditch the rest. There wasn't much left, but it brought back memories. The tackle box from our first fishing trip, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together lovingly preserved in a folder. It was hard to imagine that a man who would keep such things could have just abandoned us. I also found his final postcard, a sun-bleached hilltop town with a crumbling bell tower in its center, surrounded by pine trees and snowy mountains. What if I went? I told myself. What if I finally got some closure? What if this was what I needed to open a new chapter in my life? I checked the faded print beside the stamp. Lapixuri, Navarra, España. I had a location. All that I needed was a plane ticket. Once that was bought, I headed out for a blurry night with my high school friends, the only part of which I really remember was Alfie's drunken prophecy. 4 weeks later, I was in Madrid. Then it was a train, a bus, another bus, and a 2-mile slog up the unmarked stop where the river dropped me off. As the dusty door closed, he shot me a strange look, halfway between fear and pity. Then I was left alone in the steep, zigzagging road that led up to Lapixuri. My dad's postcard was from the 90s, but it was eerie how little the town had changed. Weathered bone-white houses, narrow stone streets, the crumbling bell tower. The room I'd rented was one of only 3 options in the whole region, and the only one where English was spoken. The owner, Erskine, was a big, energetic woman in her 50s who spent her youth in London and had decorated her rural Basque home with images of double-decker buses, police booths, and everything British. It was surreal to sit beside the hearth of a sunken medieval antechamber and sip tea in front of a giant painting of Winston Churchill with a bulldog. With a few hours of daylight left to kill, I decided to take a walk around town. Old men in slouch hats and unbuttoned shirts, playing cards or putting along in rusty tractors. Shawl-wrapped grandmothers carrying baskets of vegetables. Bored teenagers in fake leather jackets, huddled on street corners, smoking. I received a lot of hand waves and short, curious conversations on my stroll. People in Lapixuri seemed welcoming, even if we didn't share a language, but also watchful. Like they expected something terrible to happen to me at any moment and didn't want to miss it when it did. The language barrier was actually a blessing in disguise. I hoped to avoid any questions about what I was doing in Lapixuri. If people knew my true purpose, it might affect what I could learn from them. Even worse, someone might tip off my father before I could confront him. Besides, I wanted to see for myself what made this sleepy town worth abandoning a family for. When the sun set, the temperature plummeted, and a howling night wind blew down from the mountains. The stone walls were thick, however, and the wood-fired hearth heated my room marvelously. I expected to sleep deeply after so many days of travel, but I saw something just before I closed my eyes that disturbed my rest all night. As I took my last glance out my room's high medieval window, I saw something darker than the starless sky scamper away from the ledge. Whatever it was, it had been watching me. Who knew for how long? Maybe it was just a black cat. But what was it doing on a window ledge 2 stories up from the street? I set out early the next morning. I'd written down the local sites that my father had deemed especially important, and my plan was to use them as a rough guidebook, walking from spot to spot and asking the locals, as incoherently as possible, about the other weird foreigner who seemed so interested in these forgotten places. Walking down the foggy dirt roads, I kept imagining that I'd suddenly turn a corner and see a weathered figure with familiar round glasses and a sunburned nose leaning on his hoe, content with the morning's work. Would he recognize me? I was so lost in thought that I nearly fell into the first site my father had mentioned, Sogin Ohaska, the Witch's Well. The road twisted, and I found myself in a shady hollow, about to step into a fissure so deep I couldn't see the bottom. Spring water dampened the dark stone and filled the gulch with colourful flowers. I recognized belladonna, mandrake, henbane, and others that, according to my father, the witch cults used in their rites. Some had been harvested just a few days ago. I shivered, and not just because of the cool air of the valley. There was no good reason to be collecting those plants in those quantities, unless you wanted to poison quite a lot of people, or at the very least make them hallucinate for weeks on end. Even later, eating lunch beside a golden field with white-capped mountains all around me and the warm sun on my face, my thoughts went back to the neatly snipped plants of that gloomy grotto. I felt a presence behind me while I ate. I spun around to see a tired, hungry donkey just a few feet away. It was just standing there, staring at me, but there was something unsettling about its big, pitiful brown eyes. The sadness in them seemed almost human. A farmer came by to shoo the poor beast off, and I was finally able to ask a couple indirect questions about my father. Yes, he confirmed, a guy like that had come to town a while back. He lived nearby with a young lady, but they had since moved on. He wasn't sure where. My heart sank. If my father had moved without leaving a forwarding address, how would I ever find him? I reminded myself that this was just one farmer's opinion. It might be wrong. Maybe they just moved to the next village over, and so on. Even so, my heart was heavy as I set out for my next objective, Eremu Beltzak, the Black Plains. Local legend held that it was the meeting place of the witch cult, and my father considered that the disuse of such prime grazing and planting land was proof enough that something very disturbing happened there. As I passed the last of the old stone farmhouses, the road narrowed to a trail that zigzagged through the pine forest before the last opening to the plains. The view was probably spectacular, but it was already dusk and low clouds were quickly covering the fields with fog. I'd planned a circular route back to town, so it was either cross the plains or retrace my steps in the dark. I swallowed my fears, adjusted my headlamp, and set out into the cloud-covered field. The trail disappeared almost immediately. To make matters worse, the reflection of my headlamp of the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Not only could I no longer find my way forward, but I could no longer find my way back. And if anything was skulking out there in the dark, my tiny headlamp would appear brighter than a lighthouse beam. No matter where I looked, it was the same hip-high grass and opaque mist. I tried to keep from panicking, telling myself that as long as I walked in a straight line, I'd come to the end eventually. But in practice, it wasn't so easy. I had to scramble around ditches and boulders as I went, and it soon became impossible to tell which direction I was going. From down in town, the plains hadn't looked this big. Between the damp and the wind, my teeth began to chatter. I took refuge behind a boulder and consulted my GPS, but the signal was dead. Finally, I got it together enough to proceed. I was nearly knocked off my feet by a black shape that went flying past. Even now, I tell myself it was probably just a cow fleeing the rain clouds, but between the fog and my frayed nerves, it was hard not to see the black shrouded form of an old crone, her 8-foot-tall frame bloated with gluttony and wrinkled like a rotten apple. I felt sure she looked at me with a single black pupil and left behind the reek of rotten meat. Other dark shapes whipped through the fog. I couldn't be sure how many. By then, I was running for all I was worth, paying no heed to twisted ankles and slips in the mud. I didn't stop until I found a tree line, and then, somehow, the dirt road that led to Lapixuri. My landlady, Erskine, panicked when she saw the state I was in, limping, shivering, and soaked in mud. She insisted I take a hot bath, and it wasn't until I sank in the tub that I realized how sore I was. I'd had a narrow escape from getting lost in the mountains, and perhaps from something else as well. I didn't mention what I'd seen to her, more from embarrassment than anything else. Sitting here, neck deep in hot water, surrounded by thick stone walls, it was easy to imagine that what I'd seen had been a huge product of some lost cattle and my overactive imagination. Or so I thought. I climbed into bed with a groan, wondering what my next day in Lapizuri would bring. The wind still howled outside, but no dark shapes haunted my window that night. I did, however, have the most frightening, realistic dream of my life. If indeed it was a dream. It started with the rattling of Erskine's keyring and the heavy wooden door creeping open. As it did, several figures in hooded black robes scurried into the room. I say scurried because they crawled on all fours, although I could tell by the moonlight, aged skin of their hands and bare feet that were definitely human, at least in form. They disappeared from view, huddling at the foot of the bed, or maybe under it. I felt the rustling of the sheets being lifted, my socks were pulled off, and I felt the strange sensation of some kind of ointment being rubbed into my soles, and one of the hands doing the rubbing had at least 6 fingers. I didn't run. I was too sore to move, half sure that I was dreaming, and if that weren't enough, I was also scared stiff. Yet, as the hooded, crawling figures finished their disquieting work, a feeling of relaxation flooded me. I was being carried with them, up into the air, out the tiny window toward the night sky. Beneath twinkling stars, the winds carried us to Enemu Beltzak, and even with the lights of Labixuri and the toy-sized pine trees far below, I was not afraid. Not until the witch's Sabbath started in earnest. Glowing, fiery orbs circling the field provided light. A blind orchestra wrapped head to toe in black cloth provided music. We descended from the sky to a set of tables set with food that ranged from 5-star luxury fare to rotting trash. I was lowered to one of the latter tables. At the furthest point from the field from me, an enormous black he-goat sat atop an enormous throne of twisted black wood, and when its glowing red eyes landed on me, I felt compelled to eat. It didn't matter that the dead rats in front of me were swarming with still living maggots, or that the potatoes were green with mold. I ate. I ate like it was the best meal I'd ever tasted. I ate with a mad grin, like there never was and never would be any purpose to life except to gorge myself on the filth in front of me. At the high table, just below the he-goat's throne, I recognized the bloated witch, the farmer I'd met while having lunch, and my father. He raised a golden goblet in toast to me, then clicked his hooves gleefully. After dinner came the dance. I don't have words to describe the writhing, ecstatic way we came together as one flesh, and I doubt any reader has the stomach to read through it. At some point, I drifted off into the sleep of the exhausted. When I awoke the next morning, I wasn't sure if the ache I felt in my whole body was a result of my exertions the day before, or what had happened during the night. I wondered why my socks were off and laying at the foot of my bed. The moment I set foot on the stone floor, I knew I wouldn't be doing any exploring. It was hard enough to hobble downstairs and eat breakfast. If Erskine knew anything about what had happened during the night, she gave no sign. After some strong coffee, I recovered enough strength to try my plan of last resort. I go down to the town hall and ask directly about my father. Walking into the quiet marble hall, I expected to run into the same stubborn bureaucrats who my mom had struggled with all those years ago. Instead, I saw a girl about my age in a smart grey suit, hanging toys and posters beside an enormous desk. She was so focused on her work that I felt bad for interrupting her. "Can I help you?" she asked in perfect English. I began. How had she known I was there, much less what language I spoke? News seemed to travel fast in Labixuri. "I'm looking for my father, Dr. Richard Shearer," she finished for me, turning around with a smile. "The man who put us on the map." This was too much. How had she known my father's name? His books and the photos in them breathed a little life into this sleepy old town, Hardly a tourist comes by who doesn't mention wanting to hike the mountains from Dr. Shearer's posters or search for the, witches, she laughed. My name is Carmen Braggio, and I'm a great admirer of your father's. I'm Julian Chenault. Well, formerly Shearer. Did you ever meet him? My father, I mean. I wasn't at all prepared for the direction this conversation was taking. No, I was just a girl when your father came to visit us. Carmen's face clouded. He didn't stay for long. Do you have an address? I gushed. Let's see. Carmen returned to the huge desk and searched through some filing cabinets. Here it is, 28C, Zareta. But it's been vacant for almost 8 years now and... She scrunched up her brow, frowning. There's no forwarding address or any further information. Just a note that the owner moved and donated their home to the municipality. All paperwork in order. I was hoping to meet him here, I trailed off. It had all been a waste. I'd be going home sore, uneasy, and with even more questions than I'd left with. It made me want to hit something, preferably my father, if only I could find him. The anger and disappointment must have been written all over my face, because Carmen gave my arm a little squeeze. I'm sorry, she sympathized. It's been a while since you've spoken to Richard, hasn't it? 10 years, I grunted. Not a word. Well, Carmen put a finger to her lips thoughtfully. I have access to a government vehicle. I could drive you up to visit your father's former home, at least. Who knows, maybe you'll find some sort of clue. She grinned like we were children playing some kind of detective game. Only if you want, of course. 5 minutes later, we were bouncing up a dirt track toward the mountains. The wind blew through the open Jeep, making Carmen's raven hair swirl around her face. She noticed me looking and smiled. I blushed and turned away toward the icy peaks. I finally understood how someone might fall in love in a place like this. My father's former home was far above the village, even above Eremu Belzak and the pine forests. It must have been the summer home of some prosperous shepherd, nestled as it was among the boulders beyond the tree line. We rolled through the fast-flowing mountain stream and parked just in front of the 2-story stone structure. The wood shutters were closed, and the place had started to show signs of abandonment, at least on the outside. The views were majestic, but after a few walks around the property, I didn't learn anything I hadn't known before. Carmen stood beside the Jeep, hands stuffed into the pockets of her jacket against the chill wind until I returned. Any luck? She asked. I shook my head. You know, she added slyly, the house belongs to the city government. I have a key. In the dark and dusk, we found some furniture covered by bedsheets, unimportant papers scattered on the floor, some fruit preserves that had long spoiled, and some wine that hadn't. There was a whole separate wing of the house, but even with 2 of us pushing, the old wooden door wouldn't budge. I looked around helplessly. Carmen held up the bottle of wine. We shouldn't let any of this go to waste, at least, right? I got a fire going in the hearth while Carmen washed out 2 cobwebby glasses in the stream and brought us some bread and cheese from the Jeep. We curled up in the blankets we'd found and clinked glasses. Out the front door, the late afternoon valley opened up before us. Maybe it was the adventure of it all, or the intimacy of the fire, or the strength of the wine, but I told more than I meant to. About why I'd come, about my relationship with my father, about how I didn't know who I'd be without his great and terrible shadow hovering over me. There was something else that had been bothering me, something about the house, about what we'd found. It was there in the back of my head, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I looked into Carmen's eyes, as dark as the Sorghum husker. She'd been so patient with me, so kind. Whatever it was, it could wait. I leaned in for a kiss. Carmen pulled back. Aren't you going to finish your wine first? She whispered. I shot what was left without a second glance. Carmen stood up. I wondered woozily where she was going, but when I tried to follow, my legs wouldn't move. I looked at them stupidly. They felt like two useless logs disconnected from my body. I tried again. Nothing. As my vision started to blur, I remembered what had seemed strange to me before. There wasn't any dust on the wine bottle. It had been brought to the house recently. And why did my tongue feel numb? I tried to ask Carmen about it, but my mouth wouldn't work either. Carmen knelt down in front of me. She lifted one of my arms, then let it drop. Apparently satisfied, she strolled me to the door that led to the remainder of the house and opened it with a single twist of a hidden latch. Hooking me under the armpit, she dragged me like a sack of grain into the other wing, which I soon discovered was by no means abandoned. I can't swear by everything that happened next. As before, I was drugged, this time so heavily that I'd been paralyzed. But still, I insist there is a grain of truth to what I saw. Carmen tied me to a chair with black silk ropes and draped me in a red robe with a tall peaked hood. She then proceeded to kindle the hearth, light 5 black candles, and spread a red tablecloth over a long table. At its head was a throne of twisted wood that I thought I recognized. This done, she placed a small black cauldron to boil, adding water, herbs, and fat to make an ointment. At first, I couldn't see where the fat was coming from. As the fire glowed brighter, however, I recognized the source. A preserved human corpse. Only the head, torso, and one arm were left. Yet even after so many years, I recognized my father immediately. "You did say you wanted to meet him again, didn't you?" Carmen smirked. "Well, here he is. Enjoy your family reunion, while you can." She continued to prepare the room for whatever was to come, stopping only to pour some more wine in my feeble, dribbling mouth. The guests didn't begin to arrive until after sunset. They exchanged a set of words I didn't understand, like an incantation, before stepping into the room. A tall, obese grandmother, a middle-aged bald man with 6 fingers on each hand, a boy with lifeless eyes and slick-back black hair. These and many others passed by me, removed their clothes and anointed themselves with Carmen's brew before taking a seat at the table. Finally, Carmen joined them as well, but not before leading a huge black goat to the place of honor. I was in no condition to take note of their rites or conversation, even if I could have understood it. I felt like I was flying high above the twisted scene, surrounded by half-formed fiends who mocked and twirled me helplessly around the shadows of the ceiling. A few things, however, are clear to me. Firstly, the rite was almost like a reenactment of my visions from the night before. If the witches had dosed themselves in the same ointment that they rubbed on my feet overnight, no doubt they were having the same terrifying, euphoric hallucinations that I had experienced. Secondly, this was some kind of initiation for Carmen. Unlike the others, she was clothed, wearing a simple white robe. She sat at the furthest point from the black he-goat, barely eating bland food while the rest gorged themselves. A determined look burned in her dark eyes. She wanted to prove herself. Lastly, a phrase, as a Galerian Ume, kept coming up. It was always met with raucous laughter and sideways glances toward where I sat drooling in my ridiculous attire. It occurred to me that I wasn't there as some kind of sacrifice. I was there as a joke. A final prod at the man who they called Arazagal, the troublemaker, I later learned. I was Arazagalerian Umea, the troublemaker's son, and they didn't seem to care if I lived, died, or told the world about them. Who would believe me anyway? Slowly, the feeling of flying faded. With an almighty effort, I realized that I could twitch my toes and fingers. The poison was wearing off, and Carmen was too focused on the ceremony to notice. Despite my desperate urge to flee, I forced myself to stay calm and wait for more strength to return. Soon, even my legs responded, and my left ankle was so slick from the heat that I could even slip it free from the black ropes. Around the table, the witch's chanting was rising to a high point. The obese grandmother and the six-fingered man stood on the table, stomping along with the chant as it rose to a crescendo. I chose my moment carefully. Just when their ecstasy reached its peak, I kicked myself into a standing position, aimed for the door, and promptly fell over. The drug clearly hadn't faded as much as I thought. Carmen shot me a look of irritation before tying me with more black ropes. She snipped off my clothes and hung me from the rafter in front of the hearth like a pig waiting to be slaughtered. It was so hot that the sweat dripping down my naked back sizzled when it dripped onto the flagstones below. It occurred to me that maybe I'd been wrong about not being a sacrifice. After what felt like forever, Carmen closed in. She reached into the steamed cauldron of ointment and began to spread it all over me, chanting as she went. The rest of the cult repeated after her in a diabolical chorus. As she finished smearing the goop around the top of my head, I finally understood what Carmen's test had been. It all went back to the herbs collected from the Sorganahuasca. This was a test of Carmen's ability to make the poisons, hallucinogens, and other brews that the witch cult used in its rites. I was horrified to think what the effect of this final, full-bodied toxin might be. I didn't have to wait. The witches watched me from the other side of their long table, calm as doctors attending an autopsy, when my whole body began to shake and spasm. They nodded to one another approvingly. The slick-haired boy grinned and squeezed Carmen's shoulder, congratulating her. I felt my muscles twitching, stretching and shrinking, like my body was being twisted into some horrible new form. I blacked out. The smell of damp hay and feces. It was that cool blue hour just before dawn, and I was in a stable. I felt a cane lash against my back. I snorted and pushed myself to my feet with all four. Hooves? I tried to scream. I brayed and whinnied instead. My face was stretched, my back extended. Everything felt wrong, but there was no time to panic. The farmer struck mercilessly with his cane until I trotted out into the field, where the first load of the day was bound to my back. Firewood, bricks and construction, tractor parts, tools and animal feed, up the hill and back down again, with the cane never far behind. I tried to catch a glimpse of myself in a roadside creek, but I looked away immediately. It was too horrible. Even worse were the mocking grins of Carmen and the other witches when I passed them on the streets of Labixuri. I thought about the other beasts I'd seen in town. How many had once been men like me? Not that there was time to think. Each overburdened step became a struggle not to fall, and when I was finally led to the filthy paddock, I collapsed immediately into slumber. Days blurred into weeks, each the same as the last. I came to know each rut of the road all too perfectly as I hauled loads for half the village. It felt like it would never end. Until one morning, I felt a prodding in my very human ribs. It was a police nightstick. A flashlight shone in my eyes. Someone was yelling in a foreign language. I was laying naked, half-starved and delirious on a city park bench. I didn't find out that I'd been dumped in Pamplona until I saw the city name above the police station as I was being taken in for booking. Unsurprisingly, a blood test revealed that I'd been heavily drugged. The problem was convincing the police that I hadn't done it to myself. My tale about being used by a cult for the nightmarish initiation rite didn't hold up. I knew how fantastical it sounded, but it was the truth, and I thought that meant something. It came down to my word against that of the local authorities in Lapixuri. who not only denied everything, but also claimed I was wanted for being under the influence of drugs in public there as well. There was never any question about who the police were going to trust. As far as the legal system was concerned, I was just another junkie tourist. There was a horrible waiting period while the authorities debated the merits of charging me with public nudity and public intoxication versus letting me off with a fine to avoid all the paperwork. In the end, laziness won out, and over a month after I'd left, I was on a plane back home. I don't know why I feel compelled to share this story. After the sneers of the police, my academic co-workers, and even my friends and family, perhaps I just want to be believed. Perhaps rather, my story is a warning. If you go looking for the strange and mysterious, you just might find it, and the world out there is stranger than we ever dared to dream. Down at the very bottom of my garden, where the grass and rundown fence meets the field and forest beyond, is an old stone well. I'm looking at it now from my bedroom window as the deep grey clouds slowly roll their way across the sky. The first pinpricks of rain tap coldly against the glass. The well came with the house. We didn't build it or anything. It borders an old trail path, one that runs between our garden and the field. Hikers come by sometimes. They stop for a moment at the well. They toss in a coin, and then away they go, on with their lives. But I watch. I watch through the window, waiting for something to happen. Because, for as long as I can remember, I have always believed that a man has lived in the well. I'm not sure where this suspicion first came from. A dream, perhaps. When I was younger, I used to play near there. My parents never let me climb on or around the well itself, but I'd sit nearby. I climbed trees and tried to peer down into the tunnel. I'm tall enough now to just stand right beside it, of course. I'm too old to play. But I still go down to the well sometimes, run my hand over the cold, wet stone. I throw in a coin or two, make a wish. And when I do, it's almost like I can hear something, like a whispering in the back of my head, like someone trying to talk to me. It's fascinating, in a creepy kind of way. Maybe I'll go down there again now, before it gets too dark. I draw on my coat, push my arms through the sleeves, and I head from my room and down the stairs to the back door, slipping on my boots and making my way out and into the rain. I draw up my hood as I walk the length of the garden and across the grass. The grim, dark stone of the well draws closer and closer, beckoning me. Beyond it, the trees rustle softly in the breeze. Rainwater drips from the pine. I come to a stop at the well's edge, and I look over, down into the darkness below. Down it goes, deep, dark. Might as well be bottomless, for all I know. The coins never make a splash. I never hear them hit the earth or stone at the base. They just vanish into the void. I shiver. It's cold this evening. I reach into my pocket for a coin, taking one out and turning it between my fingers. Shining silver. Yes, this'll do nicely. I make my wish. My go-to is this. I wish to learn more about the secrets of the well, and I flick the coin from my thumb, watching it as it tumbles through the air and disappears down into the shadows, bouncing and tinkling off the stony walls. And then, silence. The coin falls and is lost to the void, to the gloomy, unending darkness below. I place my palms on the rough stone and look down, waiting. The rain patters on the grass all around me. I strain my ears. Come on, I mutter. Give me something. I wait a little longer. It's always right as I'm about to leave, to give up, to conclude that I've always imagined it and that nothing is going to happen. I slide my hand away from the stone. I make to turn back to the house. And it's then that I hear his voice. The voice of the man in the well. An almost imperceptible whisper, right there in the back of my mind. Almost. I hesitate. I return my attention to the well. Almost, I repeat, murmuring, what does that mean? There is a wet croak of a sound, and then, I cannot yet claim the key. My heart hammers. It's unusual to hear so much in one go. My throat dries as I lean a little closer, peering down, squinting into the darkness. What do you mean? I whisper. What key? But there, the voice ceases. I reach into my pocket for my phone. I switch on the flash and angle the light down into the well. But it does little. It gives me a couple further meters of sight, but then it is swallowed by the gloom and lost to the dark. Hello? I call down softly, then a little louder. Hello? But there is no response. The rain falls harder, and it leaks through the pine beyond the broken old fence. I sigh and turn to leave, trudging back across the grass to the house. I consider throwing in another coin, but no, I'll leave it for now. A part of me still thinks I'm making it all up, and if that's the case, well, I certainly don't want to encourage any madness. I prepare for my night as the rain clatters on the glass, casting one last look out into the grey beyond, down to the well at the bottom of the garden. I swear I can see something in the moonlight, glistening and glinting on the edge of the well. It's tough to see in the dark, but it looks like a pair of coins. Curious. I didn't see a hiker go by, and it would be unusual at such a time, and in such weather, but not impossible, I guess. I quietly draw the curtains, and the rain falls steadily through the night. The next day goes as they typically do. The weather is grim, the sky is overcast, a couple of hikers pass by. I watch from my window as they throw in their coins. I watch intently, waiting for something to happen, to hear more of those maddening, taunting words in my head. But no, there is nothing. It has to be me. I have to be the only one to make the wish. So I return that evening once my work is done. The grass is still wet, though it isn't raining tonight. I stand by the edge of the well and toss in a coin, a copper today. I make that same wish. I wish to learn more about the secrets of the well. And I wait, waiting for a response. The trees rustle nearby, the sky rolls through its tones of grey, and before me stands the well. Ancient, moss-covered stone. The walls, perhaps the only thing preventing the darkness inside from spilling out and over the land like ink. Come on, I know you have more to say, I whisper into the well, peering down. My most faithful visitor, I will be sure to reward you when I have the key, friend. This does not come through as a murmur in the back of my head. It comes through clear, cold and clear. Words that send my pulse into overdrive, and I scramble away from the gaping mouth of the well, slipping in the grass and tumbling down into the mud with a gasp. Hello? I reply in fear, scrambling to my feet and looking down into the dark. Is someone there? Hello? My rational mind battles with the irrational. A voice can only mean that someone is trapped down there in the well. But no, that doesn't really make much sense either. Do you need help? I call, though my voice cracks and breaks on this word. Yes, comes the reply, slow and measured. Just another few wishes. That's all I need. Be careful when you make them, though. I might just be able to grant them. I turn on the spot and I head the hell back to the house, noping away as my heart pounds in my chest. I just repeat the same word over and over in my head. No, 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 no. It's not real. I let my imagination get carried away. I've willed my thoughts into something beyond their means. I lock the door and return to my room. I draw the curtains, resenting that I have the house alone for the night, and I crawl into bed, staring into the darkness as the voice rattles around in my head. The voice of the man in the well. No, not possible. The man in the well does not actually exist. He can't. I fall eventually into a restless sleep. My dreams are like water. I stand in the shimmering grey of a misty field, the well at its centre. There are trees around us, I think, but they are hard to see through the fog, and every time I turn to try and look at one, its location changes. The well starts to leak. Water spills up and over the stone and flows through the grass. Roots push and creep their way from the earth, long and cream white, like bone, slithering through the grass around my feet. And as I watch in terror, a shadow rises up from the dark of the well, the darkness itself perhaps, choosing for itself a form as a grin appears in its swirling depths. It's time to make a wish, says the voice, loud and sharp. I awake in cold panic, staring up and into the dark. I haul off the sheets and head to the window, pulling back the curtains. And there, through the rain, is the well. No shadows, no creeping roots, but there are those coins again, shining silver specks on the edge of the stone. The rain falls, and angrily now I pull on my coat. I head downstairs, the steps creaking beneath my feet. I pull on my boots, unlock the back door, and march through the haze towards the well. It's just a well, I say out loud. Nothing more. I'm not going to be afraid of a cluster of stones, and I'm not losing my mind over this. I stand at the well's edge, not failing to note that the two little sparkling coins have now vanished. I run my hands over the rocks. I crouch down by the well's base to look for them, pushing my hands through the grass. But they are nowhere to be seen. I stand back up and press my palms into the edge of the well, shouting down into the void, "Show yourself!" Cold washes of fear pass through me in waves, but I persist, stubborn. "Show yourself. Let me help you find the key, or whatever it is that you want. Aren't you going to grant my wishes?" I'm just shouting nonsense, really. I know that nothing is going to respond. Surely not. I pause and wait for a response. My breathing slows. My heart rate eases. No, just as I expected, the well is empty. I reach into my pocket for a coin and toss it down the well. "I wish to meet the man in the well," I mutter as it clinks and bounces off the stone on its way down. And then, in the darkness of the night, something starts to change. For a second, I swear that I'm imagining it. But no, the ground, the very grass and earth beneath my feet, is being slowly drawn to the well. What the? I don't understand. This isn't physically possible. I take a step, then another. I stand right by the well and stay still, but I can feel my feet moving nonetheless. I look down into the darkness of the well's tunnel, seeing nothing but void. I reach into my pocket for my phone, hands shaking a little now, my breath clouding in the cold. And after a few attempts, I switch on the flash. I hold the phone over the edge, angling the light down into the darkness. And the wide-eyed face of the man in the well grins back up at me. I scream in fright and slip, staggering back and collapsing against the rotted old fence. My phone tumbles and bounces off the stone, cracking the screen in the corner before it falls into the wet grass beside me. I feel a rumbling now, subtle, in my bones and across my skin. A presence, I suppose, as the man in the well reaches a slow, shadowed hand out and over the edge of the well. His fingers are long, far longer than they have any right to be. His second hand appears beside it, slow, creeping movements, and up he rises, up and out of the well, growing taller and taller and taller. He's dressed in black, his skin too pitch black, but his eyes sparkle like silver, white and wide. And his grin, his teeth do not match. Each one looks like it could have come from a different mouth. He reaches full height, staring down at me, and yet he still ascends. With slow, terrible, deliberate purpose, he simply rises. His legs stretch upwards, up and up, until he is twice my height, and then 3 times as tall. At last he stops, and we regard each other in silence, he grinning, and myself frozen and white with fear. The rain patters around him. A worm rises up from the grass just by my hand, slithering and squirming from the earth. I open my mouth to speak, staring in horror at this monster from the well. "Don't hurt me," I whisper, and the grin of the man in the well stretches wider. "Almost free," he mutters, his lips cracking and stretching with the words. "Just a little more. Then I can come help you. I can come grant you all of your wishes." "A little more of what?" I croak out, backed up fully against the fence. "What happened to you? Who are you?" "They sealed me away," he whispers as the wind blows. "They told me I would remain in the dark until I could pay my debt." His eyes flicker from me to the worm, and then back. "When I can buy the key, unshackle myself, and be free." I stare at him, and he at I. "I don't understand," I whisper. "They sealed me away," he repeats, "but my debt is almost paid. I am almost free, and I can grant you all your wishes. My greatest patron, I owe you your wishes." "Patron?" I reply, my throat death dry. The man in the well grins wide, and in a slow, sickening gesture, he reaches into his pocket. I follow the motion with my eyes as he carefully draws from it a coin. But no, not just any coin. It's the one I threw in mere minutes ago. He cocks his head, the little dark pinpricks in the center of his eyes widening and shrinking. "The debt is almost paid. Then I will be free to leave this well, friend. After so long. And I will come for you." He begins to lean down towards me. His legs in the well remain perfectly straight, but forwards he leans, his face drawing closer to me, closer and closer. And I can take it no more. I clamber to my feet as a river of horrors runs down my spine. I lurch away and I scramble across the length of the garden. I shoot a look back over my shoulder to see him watching, to see him grinning. I slam the door to the house and barricade it shut. I race up the stairs to my room and stare through the window. And I watch as the man in the well slowly starts to sink, as he descends lower and lower. His hands at the sides disappear beneath the rim of the well, then his torso, his chest and neck, until only the top of his head is showing. One with the darkness and the shadows, his eyes like 2 shining coins in the gloom. I have not made any more wishes at the well. I have not thrown any more money down. But there is only so much I can do. I chase away the hikers that pass by like a lunatic. I stop them from throwing down their coins. But I'm heading away for college soon. A blessing and a danger. What will happen if there is no one to guard the well? My debt is almost paid, he had said. Then I will come for you. My flock of 32 lambs in my newest and southernmost paddock were a mix of newly bought and some from my own lot. With only 2 rams last November due to unfortunate cases of fly strike, I had lost a few rams and my new ewes had not birthed many lambs during spring. I was fortunate that one had birthed quads, each with a white dot on their foreheads. 4 healthy lambs from one mother ewe is a rare sight. A local farmer, Jonathan, had suggested a farm vet who had arrived in all black and supplied supplementary milk. I had to bottle feed them 4 times a day as the poor mother couldn't keep up with milk production. Sadly, one of the lambs passed away between morning feeds. An unknown cause had taken it. "The land taketh what you oweth," Jonathan whispered. At first, I thought it was just old farmer talk for, "I'm sorry for your loss." Incineration, though a standard process for dead livestock, felt far too cruel for a baby, so I buried the body deep in my fields with the rest of them. I hoped that my good treatment of the creatures would visit me back in good karma and nutritious grass for my livestock. The triplets, now 6 months of age, reside in the paddock I mentioned earlier. With their late birth, they are too young to breed and are separated from the ewes, ready for the new season. They sit larger than the rest. It was a sign that the supplementary milk had done them well and I'd fed them correctly. A proud achievement of mine. I'm relatively new at farming. The land I now own belonged to a relative on my dad's side and was eventually passed on to him. The land he had owned, yet not wanted, was given to me after his death. It took a lot of work and money to renovate it, and I've received a lot of support from the nearby farmers since then, even if they did find it strange that I suddenly wanted to become one of them. After months of intense studying to ensure the animals I raised would be treated well, I ultimately decided to start it easy with sheep. Unfortunately, I underestimated just how difficult they can be. 2 weeks ago, I visited the lambs in the morning to find them walking non-stop in an almost perfect circle. They had been doing it throughout the night, as the autumn grass had been worn down from their trotters. I even entered their flight zone, which usually would have sent them fleeing from me. However, the lambs continued their march with their lower halves coated in mud and their eyes hazed. Not even my farm dog, Holly's barking and nipping could snap them out of it. In fact, they almost crushed her. The other farmers and I had suspected listeriosis, aka circling disease, but it became a mystery when the other paddocks were not affected despite feeding on the same supplementary hay. It was as if their flock mentality had activated and they were trying to flee from something. With people I didn't know arriving to see the lambs, it became an area mystery. Even local news took an interest in the matter. However, nobody yielded a solution. In the early days, I released one of my mentally stronger, older ewes into the paddock, hoping the lambs would sense her seniority and break away from their trance. At first, she stayed clear of the group and grazed at the grass, but eventually, she too was drawn to the circle, as if magnetized. The other farmers were unsure of what to do. This behavior had been reported as common with sheep left in pens for too long, but with the vast paddock to themselves, it just didn't make sense. Jonathan had lent me a few of his farm dogs to try and break the circle up, but they remained tightly packed and unresponsive. I reached out to multiple vets, unable to track down the one that had helped me with the quads. In fact, Jonathan helped me with a lot of things, even going so far as to give me a ewe to aid with my lambing. Each vet that visited suggested listeriosis. Some of the vets had theorized that the soil in the paddock had become contaminated. Nonsense. I told them that the lambs had access to my supplementary hay as frost began to claim the fields during the night and dawn. November's cold rain flooded the fields and created thick mud. Day by day, the lambs' pathing formed a moat around the central path of grass. Despite everything, the patch of land in the middle remained dry. Some of the lambs began to pass away by day 10. Their starved and tiny bodies were stampeded and crushed to a pulp by the remaining, yet dwindling numbers. Soon enough, the moat had become so deep that I could only see the top of their heads. The farmers came by every other day, equally intrigued. They'd watch on with focused eyes and raised brows, as if the sight triggered deep thought. Each day, they witnessed a drop in the numbers of lambs, but none of them would offer their condolences. With fewer live lambs, I used the pulley system to lift the corpses out of the ground. Most of them were floppy, their bodies the consistency of beanbags with their broken and crushed bodies, some ripped apart from days of lying at the bottom. Once cleared, we used the system to trap a live lamb and lift them out. When we had gotten it to the surface, the lamb flipped out. Its body swung around violently as if it tried to get back into the pathing, and when restrained, it whipped its head around so wildly that it intentionally broke its own neck. Things like this happen. The land taketh what you oweth, Jonathan assured me. His voice was calm and soothing. Did you speak to my guy? He asked. I never got his number after his visit. Do you think you can call him? I'll give it a try. He's hard to reach. When I visited the paddock this morning, their air was thick with moisture. The fog was suffocating and foreboding. It almost felt as if I was drowning. The grass under my feet felt soft, as if the damp air had mixed with the mud and softened it. Between phlegmy coughs, I peered into the moat. At first, I heard nothing, with just 4 lambs, including the triplets, alive. Just the night before, I was doubtful they would make it through the night. And then, I heard it. A wet, slippery noise filled the air. It sounded like somebody squishing a saturated sponge repeatedly. As I crouched down to the moat, it grew louder, and despite my efforts to focus my eyes through the fog, I could only see dark blobs moving below. My feet shuffled away from the edge, fearing a mysterious figure would come from the fog and push me in if I leaned closer. An intense bleat sounded. It was harsh and loud, yet muffled, like it came from under the surface, and suddenly a rhythmic thudding echoed from below. My flashlight illuminated the water droplets in the air and revealed the faint shadow of one of the lambs. I watched as it repeatedly slammed its head into the dirt, 2 other thumps in the distance following after each other. Instinctively, I shrieked and tried to reach the depths below to stop the lamb, only for my fingertips to brush up against the now soil coat of the creature below. I recognized the material as one of the bigger dog coats I had to give the triplets due to their size. Crackling trickled into my ears, almost like a faulty electrical wire or the sound of water on hot oil. At first, it was practically impossible to hear it over the thudding, but it soon grew louder and louder, and was quickly accompanied by strange vibrations in the ground. And I noticed the central island began to crack and break. I pushed myself back onto my feet and took a few steps back, afraid that the cracks would infect the ground I stood on and swallow me up. I watched as the center caved in like a sinkhole. The hole grew bigger, swallowing up the remaining dirt until there was just one giant hole inside of the moat. Suddenly, the air became light. No more cracks, no more thudding. Nothing. Time itself stood still, while my rapidly beating heart created the soundtrack of my panic. And so, with unsteady feet, I approached the hole yet again. I feared that the remaining lambs had gotten stuck in with the muck, and my worry for them triumphed against my frightened nature. To my surprise, the 3 lambs remained stood in place. A small mud mound remained. The lump wriggled and squirmed as if something was trapped underneath. Fearing that it was one of my lambs and that it would soon suffocate, I jumped in. I clawed at the damp dirt, the muck coated my hands and crawled under my nails, until I finally hit something ice cold. It was a small lamb, less than a month old. Not one of mine. After all, lambs are only birthed in the spring. Initially, it appeared to be dead, with the same dot as the triplets. I was almost sure it was the lamb I buried just months ago. But when it stood up on all fours firmly, I was almost sent into shock. I felt the need to cover it with a blanket and warm it up. However, something about the lamb seemed strange, as if it was controlling the air around me, as if we were both the same end of a magnet. I stumbled back from the force, almost tripping over one of the hoof crevices on the pathing. The remaining 3 lambs stepped forward and lay before the middle one. The act was practically cultish, or sacrificial. There was a sense of purpose in their movement, as if they'd been working up to this moment. "Hey," I called out, followed by a whistle. They didn't spare me a glance. I knew that they had heard me. There was something different in their behavior now than earlier. They seemed to have woken up from the trance they'd been in over the past few weeks. Frantically, I scanned the surrounding area. It was doubtful somebody would be in my land, but after these 2 weeks, my place had become a hotspot. Just beyond the fence of the paddock and through the lessening fog stood a dark figure dressed in black. Perhaps another farmer had arrived to check for any updates. I opened my mouth to call out to them, but found myself lost for words. What was I shouting for? What was the emergency here? An impactful crack flooded the area, followed by a few less harsh ones. I turned my head and witnessed in horror as the smaller lambs stomped apart one of the triplets' heads. And although I'd come across plenty of corpses these past several days, this was different. My mouth flooded with saliva, and stomach acid soon followed, the pressure too much for my lips to hold back, and soon enough I painted the ground with my insides. When I looked back, the lamb had begun to feast on the viscera. "Stop!" I screamed, my hands waving dramatically in the air to seem huge and intimidating. "Stop it!" My throat burned as I cried, still coated with a mix of last night's meal and drinks. The lamb did not listen, and with the intense force pushing up against me, I could only watch on in disgust as it turned to another one of the triplets and did the same. In just seconds, it all became too much. Erratically, I climbed out of the hole and searched the surface for help, but the figure was gone. I was alone. "Help," I called through the moisture. "Please, come back." The skull burst and cracks echoed again as the lamb made contact with its final target. I didn't have to look. I couldn't. Feeling helpless, I ran. No matter how far I fled from the scene, I couldn't escape the images in my head. The atrocity which happened right in front of me was barbaric, unexplainable, and left my stomach in knots. When I'd created a large distance from the hole, I spared a look back, my feet still stumbling ahead of me. Through the fog, multiple figures stood eerily around the site, staring into the crater below. It was difficult to make out any identifying features. Suddenly, the surrounding ewes and rams in the remaining paddocks began bleating in unison, as the shadows around the hole shifted and moved. I didn't stick around for longer, fearing I owed the land much more than I could ever give it. As part of my doctorate, I was hired as a lab assistant working with pediatric treatment. We were working on a paper measuring the exposure effect of a potential contaminant. While my colleagues were working on the measured effects on adults and the elderly, my team would work with children. The potential disruption to developing adolescence was deemed important enough to have a separate set of experiments and measurements. The study garnered unilateral attention and funding of not only one, but 4 different pharmaceutical companies, Hatchet Pharmaceuticals being the main contributor. I was hired pretty late in the process. I wasn't even sure what the contaminant was, as it was just designated as the contaminant. Apparently, it was something that resided just under the topsoil in a large residential area. To not taint our measurements, my colleagues and I were given minimum information about the symptoms to look for and what to expect. Instead, we were provided a set of experiments and willing participants. It was all fast and haphazard. Most of us started on a Monday, and Tuesday the following week was the day of our first experiment. Little time to prepare, get settled, or even understand. Still, this could be big enough to launch a career. The experiment, described as Cognition and Ocular Development Assessment, CODA, was to be performed with full consent and supervision of the parental guardians. All children were between 6 to 10 years old, and none of them had any observed deformities or illnesses. We were given limited access to certain medical records to make sure our study didn't have the potential to cause any harm. Then again, I'd read the experiment checklist, and there was nothing that could damage anyone. If anything, I argued the results would be pretty much useless. As Tuesday came around, me and my 2 colleagues had prepared as best we could. The 3 of us would put 1 participant each through a series of tests. The CODA was 3 tests over the total of 3 hours. The parents were to be asked for consent before and after each step and given the ability to stop any test at any given time. The experiment overall was surprisingly simple. It was supposed to be a measurement of cognitive and emotional development, mostly tested through facial and spatial recognition. The day of the experiment, I first met Logan, an 8-year-old kid sporting a baseball cap and a brand new Pokemon t-shirt. His mom was a bit anxious, but from what I've been told, she had been generously compensated. As I met them in the parking lot and led them inside, I promised her we'd go through the specifics. "Don't worry," I said. "We're mostly going to look at pictures. Doesn't sound too bad, huh?" He shook his head, but I'd yet to see him smile. Maybe his mom's anxiety rubbed off on him. The testing room was somewhat small and made entirely out of concrete. There was a pair of opposite 2-way mirrors on each side of the room. The walls were painted this sickly mint green colour, a colour so neutral it hurt to look at. The first test was all about emotional intelligence. In sets of 6 pictures each, I was to show Logan various expressions and ask him which mostly correlated to an emotion. If they answered objectively wrong, according to a chart, we were supposed to ask them to explain their choice. Simple enough. I'd done something similar before. But this is where I first realized that Logan wasn't some ordinary kid. As I laid out the first image set, I asked him to identify the happiest face. Clearly, it was card number 3, and Logan answered as much without hesitation. In the second image set, he was asked which one was the saddest. Again, it was number 3. He answered correctly again. In the third picture, the 6 pictures were a wild mix, some sad, some happy. One guy was sleeping in the corner, "Which one is the angriest?" I asked. There was a correct answer. Number 4. A woman furrowing her brow and exposing her teeth. Yet Logan looked at them all for a long time. "Number 6, he said finally, pointing at the sleeping man. "How come?" I asked, following protocol. "It's complicated. They almost killed his mom." The kid seemed almost distant, staring at the picture. "What the hell?" He answered the rest of the questions flawlessly, but that answer stuck with me. Such a strange reaction. Not only did he answer wrong to an obvious question, but it was also such an odd explanation. Logan himself seemed to have trouble finding the right word for it. The second test was similar, but there were new cards. In sets of 3, Logan was supposed to explain each emotion presented by the people in the pictures. Happy, sad, angry, scared. It was similar to the first test, but much more detailed. For every image, there would be a description and a short explanation given by the participant. We pressed forward. First 3 cards, no problem. Happy, happy, sad. Easy explanations. Second set of cards, same result. Surprised, sad, sad. But when the third image set came along, I didn't know what to say. 3 people, all completely neutral, not a single emotion on their face. They looked almost computer-generated. Logan didn't skip a beat though. "She's scared," he said. "She doesn't know why she's doing this. And, what about this one? Oh, he's hungry. He just doesn't show it." "Hungry? Is that an emotion?" "Yes, he's really hungry. Dangerous." "And the third one?" Logan took a long, hard look. After a few seconds, he looked up at me, almost like he forgot about the picture for a while. "Okay, I think he's Obstin." "Obstin?" "Yeah, Obstin." "What do you mean?" "That's what he is. I don't know a better word for it." "So why is he, Obstin?" "He saw something he shouldn't have." We continued with several more image sets, and Logan gave mostly ordinary answers, but every now and then he'd throw in something absurd sounding. Obstin was the first, but there was also Ada, Gald, and Srit. The descriptions were outlandish, and frankly nonsensical. Ada, he stared too long into the light. Gald, he didn't go swimming, but his feet are still wet. Srit, he fell between the cracks. By the time I was about to start the third experiment, I had a few moments alone with Logan's mom. Still anxious, she held her arms close to herself and didn't meet my eyes. "We'll be done in a bit," I said. "He's doing great. He's such an imaginative child, you know." She nodded. "He makes up things all the time. You should see his drawings." "Does he have any trouble at school?" "No, not really. No," she smiled. "Well, mostly not. Some of the other kids can get a bit creeped out when he starts making things up." I checked the clock. It was time to start the final experiment. "All kids have a quirk or two," I smiled back. "That's what makes them kids." The final experiment was about recognizing places rather than people. One by one, I was to show Logan pictures of various places. Ordinary places like supermarkets, playgrounds, and factories. They were pretty easy to recognize. First, I'd show him the pictures, then I'd ask him to describe the scene. Logan didn't seem to mind. The pictures themselves were easy for Logan to recognize. One by one, he explained what he saw. Factories with lots of cars parked outside, empty playgrounds. But as we got to a park, he sort of stopped. His expression shifted. "That's a graveyard," he said. I had to stop myself from correcting him. It was obviously not a graveyard. Can you describe it? I asked. I really don't want to. There's a lot of people there. What kind of people? I was going off script, but I was just too curious. Logan leaned in to look closer at the picture. There's a lot of strange colors, he said. The people who used to be there are gone. I couldn't tell what he was seeing. The picture was empty. As we finished up, Logan went to the bathroom. I got some time to talk to his mom on our own, and I brought out the picture of the park. Do you have any idea what he sees here? I asked. No, she said, shaking her head. Could be anything. It's just strange, I said. Usually, kids make up stories about dragons, lasers, wizards, that kind of stuff, not graveyards in parks. Are you calling my son strange? I lost my train of thought. As Logan came back, she grabbed him by the arm to leave. Before they did, I caught up to them. I had to try something. Logan, I said, just a minute. They stopped, and his mom gave me a tired look. I was thinking of buying this house, I said, bringing up a photo of a place I've been checking out a few times. What do you think? He just stared at me, as if he didn't understand. He took off his baseball cap and scratched his ear. Looks dirty, he said. A lot of raw, right there in the... Come on, Logan. His mother tugged his arm, and he was almost dragged down the hall. Turning back to me one last time, he yelled back. He looked up, and then he didn't. I didn't lie when I said I was thinking about buying that house. There was an open viewing the next day, and I decided to drop by on my lunch break. There were about 8 other people there, all couples. I kind of disappeared among them. Maybe I wasn't being considered as a serious buyer. The place was a bit too large for me after all. As the realtor ran off to speak to a pregnant couple, I stopped in the foyer. I had this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. Ro, I whispered to myself, right here. Just saying it out loud almost made me feel it. It was something so specific, so unique. It wasn't an emotion as much as it was an experience, a story. I could imagine myself lying on the floor, looking up at the wood-brown ceiling. I could feel my back grown stiff, as if I'd been lying down for too long. I could feel my eyes grown thick, like blinking through mud. Every breath, a conscious effort, arms unresponsive, a prayer for my heart to keep beating. Then, nothing. Raw, to look up, and then to not. I had this strange understanding, like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. Didn't the kid have a word for that too? God, I felt sick. Everyone was gathered around the realtor in the living room. I don't know what gave me the courage to confront him, but I just blurted out. Did the previous owner die here? I asked. In the foyer? No, they didn't, he answered. You have to tell us if they did, one of the couple said. Another couple agreed. Okay, yeah. I mean, no one has died here. That much is true. No one did. But yes, they were found unresponsive in the foyer. There were loud sighs. A couple immediately left. Another left shortly afterwards. There was a queue to talk to the realtor, and within 10 minutes, I was the only one left. Pro or not, I got the place too cheap to care. This made me curious as to the words the kid had used to describe the various places and emotions. Over the following days, as I transcribed our findings, I started thinking about them a lot more. Staring into the light too long, to get wet feet without swimming. It was all just cryptic nonsense. But what I'd felt that first night in my new house, that was raw. I could feel it. It was the right way to describe it. One night, as I stood in the bathroom, I thought about the word adder. It was what Logan had used to describe staring into the light for too long. It felt fitting, but I didn't know if I'd experienced it. I tried looking up into the bathroom light and just saying it out loud, but I didn't get the same feeling as when I'd said raw in the foyer. This wasn't it. This wasn't adder. I sort of gave up on it after a while, but as I was watching TV, the thought came creeping back to me. There was a news segment about a patient with severe brain damage, a woman who couldn't breathe on her own or speak. She was aware, in a sense, but completely imprisoned in her body. The segment focused on how her family was caring for her, but I just leaned in closer and looked at her. Adder, I whispered to myself. That's it. And it was. No question about it. She was Adder. From staring into the light too long. I could feel it, understand it. Over the next couple of days, I started chasing Gald. The word meant someone whose feet was wet, despite not swimming. It took me a while to get this one, but I finally found it in a newspaper article online. I felt Gald from reading about a man who had died from an overdose down at the beach. His body had apparently choked itself, causing him to sweat to death. As he was homeless and living close to the beach, he'd been found by a couple of teenagers building a sandcastle. But that feeling of drowning on dry land, next to the ocean, that was Gald. With the right word, I could feel it. I could empathize. In my mind, I could be there with him. But the final word I noted, Surit. That was a difficult one. Over several days, I looked all over the internet. I searched forums, read obscure articles ranging back to the 90s, but I just couldn't shoot blindly into the web and hope for the best. I had to find out more, get something substantial. That thought made me take a step back. What about the photos? The photos which had shown Logan in the first place? Who were the people in the photos? I checked the inventory list for the experiment. Most of the cards were just mentioned as a number and an emotion, but I noticed that some of the faces were repeated with the same actors. All the cards which Logan had gotten right were repeated at least once. But the weird ones? Those were unique faces. The lighting was different. They didn't show any peculiar emotions. They were just strange people, a bit off. I took a few photos with my phone and tried to do an image search. I couldn't get a single hit. These pictures simply weren't available anywhere online. The ordinary emotions displayed could be found on various stock image sites, but not the strange ones that Logan pointed out. Finally, after a few hours and dozens of pages clicked through, I did find a picture that looked like one of the models, but in a completely different setting. And this was just weird. The picture I found online was from a social media profile. The profile, in turn, portrayed the user page of the very same homeless man that had drowned in his own sweat from an overdose. The same one I'd read an article of, but the article was written just a few days prior, and the picture must have been taken at least weeks ago. Listen, I don't know if you can get this. What Logan did was to perfectly describe, using one of his made-up words, was exactly what was about to happen to that man. The man who gulled, who overdosed on the beach. I mulled the whole thing over in my head countless times, and finally, I just gave up. I had to talk to Logan again. I did the creepiest thing I've ever done. I tracked down the kid at his school. The following day, As he was about to get on the bus back home, I waved at him from across the parking lot. He was surprised to see me, and couldn't place me at first. Then I could see him recognize me, like something lit up in his mind. "Hey," he called out. "Science man." "Hey, Logan," I called back. "How's it been?" "Good," he said. "You're not here for more tests, are you?" He stopped a few feet ahead of me. "Actually, I'm just here to ask you about that language of yours. Those strange words you use. How do you come up with them?" "That's easy," he said. "Once you start talking it, you kinda don't stop. After a while, you just feel them, you know." "So, where did you learn it?" I asked. "Anywhere special?" "I think I always knew," he shrugged. "Like, it's weird. Like listening, but not to a sound, but like a color. It's sort of just there, inside. So, you can always see it? Because sometimes you said people in the pictures were just happy or sad, ordinary things. Well, sometimes those things are easier to see. You said I should answer fast, not, accurately. So, you can see it now?" I chuckled. "Anywhere, here with me?" "Sure," he smiled. "Just stand still for a bit." Logan looked at me for a while. As I met his eyes, I could feel something. There was that feeling again. Hobston. To see something I shouldn't have. Right there in that kid's eyes. He knew something. Strangely enough, it wasn't him that broke the silence. It was me. "Hathoes," I said. I didn't know why I said it, but it took Logan by surprise. The one who shouts until they listen," he said. "That's what it means, right? I think that's me." "I don't know," I said. I'm sorry, Logan. I don't know why I said that." "Did you see it?" he asked, almost excited. "Do you see it now?" I want to say that I didn't. I want to say that I saw nothing, but that'd be a lie. A million little words crept into my mind, and as I stared into that kid's eyes, I saw something I shouldn't have. Now it was all becoming clearer. The more words I knew, the better I understood. The word I looked for, Srit, was a lot more complex than Logan had made it out to be with human words. It was contextual. The man had died in an earthquake. He fell between the cracks. No, he hadn't. He was going to. It was describing events destined to unfold. But it was also describing something that had happened. Was it both? Neither? "I see it," I admitted. Right there, I could feel the parking lot falling away in insignificance. With a single spoken word, we could tell each other infinite things. These mundane expressions were just the tip of the iceberg, a dumbed-down shadow of what was truly being said. The words told us of things that were, things that could be, and things that currently was. And in that moment of silence, of understanding, I heard the vibrant colours so clearly I could almost see them. They were piercing into my mind, forcing themselves into my understanding, screaming to me that once you understand something, you can't unlearn it. I forgot to breathe, as to not accidentally say something I shouldn't. "You weren't talking about the pictures I held up in the test. You were looking at me," I said, with nothing but shallow breath. "I'm Hobston. You didn't even look at the picture." He didn't have to answer. I knew it was true. It was written into the word itself that my realization would come. Then, as possibilities came rushing towards me, I could feel an enormous weight come down on me. My mind couldn't take it. My body was shutting down as I fell to my knees, screaming until my neck felt raw. The world started to fade as my heartbeat swallowed my hearing. I have a hard time describing what happened next. When I closed my eyes, I'd see millions of possibilities, mostly pain, suffering, and terror. My own thoughts and emotions multiplied like a torch in a hall of mirrors. I'd see myself waking up in my bed, only to get murdered by 1,000 different weapons. I'd see myself drowning in my bathtub, breaking my neck, falling down the stairs. Death. So much death. And then, in the blink of an eye, I'd be in the back of an ambulance, feeling the residual effect of a defibrillator on my chest. As I blinked, the ambulance burst into flames. The driver crashed into a tree, someone carving their initials into my chest with a scalpel. None of it was real, but I couldn't tell anymore. Different words, with nothing but a well-placed syllable. All the while, I was just spitting out seemingly random words. My eyes lost focus, and as I lost grip of reality, my body shut itself down in self-defense. Thank God. This was back in January of 2019. Logan was born with this language already stored in the back of his mind, some kind of residual effect from this contamination. But for people like you and me, we can't take it all at once. So, over the years, with intense therapy to back me up, I've settled on trying to learn one single word. I'm going to find out as much as I can about just what it means to be obstinate, the word describing me. There was so much to that one word that you could fill a lifetime with it. In a way, maybe that was the point. A God language meant to fit all of our very beings into simple expressions, like compressing a folder into a zip file. But that's just the thing. To learn what it really means to be obstinate, to be my word. I can't really do anything else but to live and see what happens next. Not unless I want to go back to where my mind wandered off to. Still, sometimes I could feel something creeping back into my mind. Little tingles, syllables and sounds, reminding me of all the knowledge I still have stored away somewhere in my inner madness. Little words with galactic proportions. It is easy to slip back into that mind, just inches away from the edge of what my physical brain can hold. I sometimes wonder what all your words are. I sometimes wonder what they mean. I'll really, really try not to think about it. Did you do it? Did you mail them? Terence leaned against my cubicle and raised an eyebrow. I was going to put them through the letterbox, I said, struggling to remember when and what I'd told him. Seemed like a waste of time to go to the post office and actually mail them. She'll get them all the same. He nodded. Marriage is tough, he said. How long? 16 years. He whistled between clenched teeth. That's a fair stretch. We had to do counselling ourselves. Nothing serious, you know. But it's easy to stop looking at the other person as, well, a person. Sharing secrets is a good way to open that communication back up. That was a fair point, and I nodded to show my agreement. Not that I wanted to get into any of this with my boss. It was personal business. I wasn't even entirely sure how he knew we were having problems, let alone what homework we'd been given by the therapist. Look, I began to say while gesturing half-heartedly to my computer. I've got work to... What did you write? He asked. What was your secret? The question caught me off guard, and I'm sure my face showed it. But Terence was unfazed. Come on, tell it, he added. I decided to lie. I wrote that I don't enjoy cooking as much as I say I do. Oh, please, he groaned while rolling his eyes. We both know she doesn't do the cooking. How? The thing about marriage, he said while suddenly pulling over an empty chair and sitting on it so close to me that our knees touched. The thing is, you've got to learn to trust one another over and above anything else. Does that make sense? Up close, I could see sweat beading on his forehead. No, I stammered. Put it like this, he said. You haven't had her first secret yet. You might be wondering if she was going to post it to you, like the exercise required, or if she was going to slip it onto the kitchen table one morning, or if she would just hand it to you one-on-one, no expression, nothing to say other than a "this is yours" sort of thing. But that doesn't really matter, does it? You need to learn to trust that she's going to get it to you no matter what. That's the bond between you. So why concern yourself about the details? Why worry about the how and the why of it all? You need to put your faith in her. Still smiling, he reached into his pocket and removed an elegant cream envelope the size of a playing card. My name was written on the front in my wife's perfect cursive. Terence gently placed it on my lap and went to get up. But as he leaned out of his chair, he stopped just as his face was closest to mine. I've had that in my pocket since the day I hired you, he said before walking away with cheery confidence. Astounded, unnerved, but not quite afraid. Not yet, anyway. I opened the envelope and read what was inside. Unlike you, Terence has never had any choice in the matter. What the hell? I muttered, and I stood up to try and find where my boss had gone. He was standing in his office, staring right at me, one hand on the sliding door that leads to the balcony outside. He smiled and gave me a wave before opening them and stepping out into the open. Then he began to jog, and like a swimmer taking a dive, he jumped headfirst over the railing. They laid a rubber sheet over what was left of him. I wondered if at some point someone would have to come along with special equipment and scrape my boss off the street. Until then, they couldn't just bag him. Not in that state, and certainly not all of him at once. I think it'd be best if you don't drive home. The police officer was a stern woman in her 40s, luminescent yellow jacket, hooded eyes, a thin line for a mouth. I found it hard to maintain eye contact with her. You've been through a lot, she said. Do I need to make a statement? I asked, and the jittery, washed-out sound of my own voice surprised me. Helpless and afraid, like a child after a big temper tantrum. The CCTV footage is fairly clear-cut, she replied. We might contact you at a later time, but we can't see any reason this won't be ruled as self-inflicted. Right now, I'm most concerned about you. Do you have someone you can call? She glanced at my wedding ring. No, I said, with a firm shake of the head. I'd like to see a doctor first. That's the smart thing to do, the policewoman replied. You look like you're in shock. She took my arm and guided me to a car, a bright yellow monstrosity. I'd grown up hiding from cars like that, ducking under bushes and stubbing out joints or emptying cans of lager into the soil. Climbing into the back felt incredibly wrong, but I let her guide me into my chair and felt oddly grateful for it. What I wanted in that moment was for the world to start making sense again. She seemed to exude that confidence, like she'd seen it all and knew what to expect. She turned the ignition and it started to rain. I thought of Terence's remains going runny in the water, swirling down drains like raspberry ripple, and I had to shut my eyes and clear the images. Are you sure you don't have anyone to call? The policewoman asked. I opened my eyes and saw her angling the rearview mirror to get a good look at me. My wife's away on a work trip, I lied. I'll talk to her after the doctor. I just don't want to worry her about nothing. She appeared to chew on this for a while before speaking again. It's hard, she said, having a spouse who's always away for work. My husband, when he did come home, oftentimes it felt like he weren't even there at all. Quiet, disinterested, good with the kids, but when it was just us, he shut down. I nodded, unable and unwilling to engage in conversation. He was a good man, just not a feely-feely kind of man. Mind you, if I had one of them, I probably wouldn't like... I zoned out, putting my head against the window and closed my eyes. I focused on the sound of rain against the glass and let my mind go blank. Unlike you, Terence has never had any choice in the matter. The words were an intrusion, and I sat up straight to try and stop them sticking. All it takes is a look now and again, or a gentle squeeze of the hand, or even just the fact he comes home at all. I guess what I'm trying to say is that love isn't always expressed the way you expect it to. Geez, I thought, she's still going on. I mean, look at a dog, right? She continued. They expect love to be expressed by sticking a nose up their ass, but over time, they learn that being scratched behind the ear is just as good. The food, the water, the shelter. Our love may not be in the same language, but they understand it just as well. They know, and that's what I think you need to take forward with your wife. Same way a dog owner has to make lots of decisions on the dog's behalf. When to have a bath, when to go for walks, when to be disciplined, when to be castrated, when to be euthanized. Well, your wife has to make tough decisions all the time too, and you may not understand them, but you just need to remember that it's all done out of love. Thoughts were trickling into my mind a little too fast. What's happening? What did the letter mean? Why is this woman saying these things? Why does she look so afraid? I looked outside and saw that we were pulling into an old industrial estate. In the distance, the city rumbled, but out here, on the other side of the river, there was muffled silence. Even as a kid, we didn't come to places like this. Where are we going? I asked. I tried to get a closer look at my surroundings. The rain was so heavy that the world had turned a sullen twilight, and I could barely make out the shape of the road through the water-dappled window. She laughed. You've been staring at that window so long, but you haven't once looked at the seat beside you. My heart sank. I could have sworn the seat was empty when I got in. Surely I would have noticed. I looked and saw it. A letter. You should be a little more observant, she said as we rolled into an empty lot. Its sole occupant, a red brick building with faded white letters. Even through the rain, I could recognize the name on the side. It belonged to my wife's family, a long-abandoned milk bottling plant. Then again, maybe not. Who knows? She let out a nervous cackle. Maybe being unobservant is what's kept you alive for so long. A little dumbstruck, I reached over, took the cream envelope and opened it. Everything I have, and by extension, everything you have too, is because of them and what we do on their behalf. When I looked up, the policewoman was gone. I hadn't heard the door go, and the keys were still dangling in the ignition, but the engine was no longer running. I took the letter into my pocket, next to the other one, and noticed an umbrella and flashlight had appeared on the seat beside me, where the envelope had sat just moments ago. I wondered if it was possible that I'd zoned out enough that I'd failed to notice the policewoman leaving, or even leaning over to put a few things on the back seat. It didn't seem feasible, but then again, my head felt all wrong ever since Terence had approached my desk. Maybe my memory was just a bit spotty. Maybe I'd missed the policewoman leaving and wandering off somewhere. Maybe she had an answer that meant all this would make sense. I just had to find her. I opened the door and stepped out into the rain. With nowhere else to go, I approached the old bottling plant. It was a mishmash of jagged chimneys and broken windows, its walls covered with threadbare graffiti that screamed obscenities at the world. Once upon a time, they'd bottled half the milk for the city in those walls. Other properties with a family name still dotted the city, some still active, others abandoned like this one. All of that was my wife's domain, the sole daughter of wealthy parents who didn't even live to see her enter her teens. She'd been running the family's estate since before we met. She was an impressive woman, my wife. I'd seen old men with bulldog faces sent scuttling out of our kitchen with their tails between their legs. Rich and powerful men put in their place by the woman I shared a bed with. I'd be lying if I said I didn't find it thrilling. "Hello, officer?" I shouted the words into the darkness with one hand on the doorframe. Thunder boomed behind me, and the rain fell even harder. I could hear it inside the building, where it must have found its way through cracked tiles and broken windows. For some reason, the sound made me think of camping. Inside, an old conveyor belt took up most of the floor. Trolleys full of old milk bottles. One had overturned and coated half the ground with smashed glass that crunched under my shoes. Up high, I saw an office that overlooked the work floor. A metal stairway that once led to it had since collapsed and lay in one corner, a heap of rusting iron. Unless someone climbed the wall or brought a ladder, that office was off limits and had been for decades. An isolated island that drew my curiosity. When I shone my torch at the window, I caught sight of something retreating from the light. A passing shadow maybe, an animal I hoped, but it killed any desire to try and get up there. I cried out once more in the hope that I'd find the policewoman and I wouldn't have to stick around for much longer. "Hello, is anyone there?" I spun in a slow circle and listened carefully. My light found some graffiti covering an entire wall. "They don't like the light." The words plucked at something in my chest and left me feeling hollow. Was this the same they as in the letter, I wondered. A glance back at the office window revealed nothing, although I wasn't even sure why I looked. What did I expect to see? Beneath the graffiti, I found a set of stairs that led to a lone door, a scrap of luminescent yellow fabric hanging off the door handle. "Is anyone down here?" My voice sounded increasingly desperate. I had to push hard against the door to create a gap big enough for me to squeeze through. With just my head around the jamb, I got a glimpse of the obstruction. Dozens of old boxes and filing cabinets had been dragged and dumped against the frame. A poorly constructed barricade. I climbed over it, carefully picking my footholds like I was descending a deadfall. On the other side was a derelict corridor with broken bulbs in the ceiling and peeling wallpaper. Several doors ran along both walls. I tried the closest room and found a 70s style office with most of its fittings removed. Plaster had been smashed and wires were in the process of being stripped. A few plastic bags full of copper wire were piled up against the wall. In another corner lay some cardboard flattened like a bed. I wondered if whoever had slept there was the same person who'd gone looking for copper, and if so, why had they left it all behind? The only other thing of note was an old safe as tall and wide as a man, its vault door ajar. I pulled it open and found that the safe was hollow and without a back. Behind it, a hidden tunnel carved into soil, its walls buttressed with sagging wooden beams. "Screw that," I muttered quietly before pushing the door shut and moving on. The next room was almost completely empty. No carpet or linoleum, not even plaster on the walls. Something rust brown stained the floor in a meter-wide splash. It surrounded an old drain like a halo. Nearby was an old dentist chair with frayed leather straps that had been turned over on its side. For a second, I thought I can taste the spray of aerosol blood. but I put it down to my imagination. I tried another door and found an empty space with 3 boxes covered in a white sheet stacked against the wall like a pyramid. It was a display. Hundreds of handprints had been pressed onto the plaster behind it, printed in either blood or feces. I couldn't tell. They radiated outwards like an explosion. Hundreds, maybe thousands of hands, and they varied in size from an adult man's to the chubby paws of a toddler. This was not the work of a single crazy person. It felt religious, cult-like. The workers, perhaps? I approached the altar and saw that there were faint imprints of dust where objects had once sat central to the entire scene. When I turned to leave, I caught sight of another message that had been scrawled on the wall behind me. Those who dwell in the dark love you. Beneath the words was something that resembled a cave painting of a maggot crossed with an elephant. This was another nope moment for me, and I left the room as quickly as I could, terrified at the way the darkness seemed to solidify as my mind processed the words. There were a few doors left, 3 on the wall opposite me and 1 at the far end of the hall. I considered checking each one, but I found it hard to imagine the policewoman waiting patiently in one of these rooms with a sensible explanation. I was about to try anyway, when I heard the faint clink of glass bottles rolling around the factory floor. I hesitated, not sure what the best response was. It was probably just a policewoman up there, I told myself, but feverish imaginings kept me from running up there to find her. Slowly, the corridor filled with a smell that made my nose wrinkle and my eyes water. Sour milk poured over sun-baked roadkill. It inspired a disgust more powerful than anything else I'd experienced. An evolved repulsion meant to keep curious apes away from black, carrion shapes lurking in the undergrowth. Every instinct I had was at war with a rational part of my mind, and in the ensuing panic, I froze. The paralysis only broke when the barricaded door jerked open an inch. Something was on the other side, and my mind raced with images of what I'd seen that day. Not just the altar or the gurney with the bloodied straps, but Terence as well. Broken, smashed, pulped, smiling fearfully as he leaned close to my face. What forces could make a man do what he did? Before the door could open any further, I decided to hide, carefully slinking towards the office and the secret tunnel. I opened the safe and tried not to panic at the sound of the barricade coming apart just a few meters away. I'd already turned my torch off by this point, but a corpulent green shimmer was slowly filling the entire basement. I slid inside the metal box and tried to pull the door shut behind me. Not all the way. I had images of myself suffocating. Quietly, I maneuvered through the tunnel with my breath held. Much to my relief, it was barely 50 feet long. On the other side, a room. Stone walls straight out of an ancient temple. Ancient slabs of stone as big as a man laid on top of one another. And all around me lay dozens of archways with sloping grounds that led deep into the earth. And yet, juxtaposed against this mausoleum, piled up against the farthest wall, was a misshapen pile of children's backpacks. Lilac, pink, green, yellow, red. Whoever owned the Mario 64 backpack at the foot of the pile would be old enough to have children by now, I thought. But somehow, I suspected they never got that far in life. The pile rose as high as my head, and there, at the top of the slope, was the source of what little light I had. A grill set into the ceiling. I had to hope it led to safety. All thoughts of the policewoman were gone by now. I would have stolen the car if it meant getting the hell away from whatever had made that smell. The bags made a poor ladder. For each successful foothold I found, it took 6 or 7 failed attempts. I could feel the entire mountain compress beneath my weight. I stopped only once when that god-awful smell finally found me. I risked the torch and briefly shone it behind me, and glimpsed something awful filling the tunnel. I didn't let my eyes linger, not even for a fraction of a second, but whatever it was, it hit my sensory organs like a breeze block. My eyes rolled back in my head, my diaphragm shrank until my lungs screamed, and the next thing I knew, I was hauling myself out of the grill and into fresh air. Whatever was down there, it felt almost radioactive. I had no control over myself. I stumbled to my feet, glanced around the empty lot, and realized I was mere feet from the door of the bottling plant I'd fled. Nearby lay the police car, although now the headlights are on and the sun had nearly set. I stumbled towards it, desperate to flee. I didn't bother getting in the back. I opened the driver's side and clambered in. Someone had set the heaters to run, and I was thankful for it as I sat there shivering. Before I put it in gear and drove away, something nagged at me from the passenger seat. Another letter. I took this one out without fanfare. I know what they are capable of, and a few children is a small price to pay. I thought of the mountain of backpacks, and I took the letter into my pocket. "I'll give you a shot," the doctor grumbled. "Not much else I can do, just a bunch of scratches. It'll help if you tell me what happened." "I got shoved into a dumpster," I replied. He merely grunted as he pulled the cap off a syringe with his teeth before sticking the needle in my arm and pushing the plunger. "How's Seffi doing?" he asked as he wiped my arm down with a cotton swab. I shrugged. "All right, I suppose. You know since you were kids, right? What were her parents like?" "Cold, funny, clever. Like Seffi," I replied. "Uh-huh." After giving me my shot, the doctor stood over by his desk, back turned to me, and lazily filled out forms with a scratchy pen. The room was poorly lit and small. Outside, a torrential downpour that, if it continued, would quickly burst the river's banks and make the news. "There's nothing wrong with you," he turned and shrugged. "Looking at you, I think you just need a glass of water and some sleep. I'll get right on it." I found it hard to move. I only had one other place to go. "You need me to call a taxi to get you home?" he asked. I saw someone die today," I said. "Ooh." The doctor nodded like it all suddenly made sense. "That was where you work, wasn't it? I saw the news. They brought him here." "What?" "They brought him here for the post-mortem. This place mostly handles the city's dead." He said it like it was the mildest piece of trivia he knew. "Very little treatment actually goes on here. Only a few private patients are registered with us. You can thank Seffi for being on the list." A long silence. Something about this place was creeping under my skin. Maybe it was the poor lighting, darkness behind every door and every corner. Made me think of the stuffy old manners Persephone toured me through every time we visited some distant relative or wealthy socialite. Old money doesn't pour its resources away lighting every room in a mansion, and sunlight won't go very far in a house with 62 rooms. Take the wrong turn and you'll end up staring down a corridor so long it has a vanishing point. Ice cold, an eternal twilight. Doesn't matter what time of day it is. Some places never feel bright or warm, and the clinic was no different. What few lights were on flickered overhead intermittently, and they only covered the corridor I'd been led down. Everywhere else lurked in shadow. They don't like the light. "I might have something to help," the doctor suggested after the silence stretched on a little too long. "Give me a few minutes. I'll see what I can do." "What?" He marched out to the room and left me alone. I waited as the seconds rolled into minutes. I felt like a fly stuck in a web, waiting while the spider attended to other, more pressing business. A part of me felt like I should be struggling, looking for a way out of this place. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling became. Eventually, I stood up, unable to sit, kicking my feet for any longer. I looked around. Old medical posters of the cardiovascular system covered the wall, their corners peeling and their colours faded. The doctor's desk was a mess, papers everywhere. I slid a few over and saw the inevitable. I figured, I muttered when I saw the cream letter lying amongst the things. I took it, hesitated to open it, but did so anyway. After all, it wasn't snooping. It had my name on it, and I recognized my wife's handwriting. They could take anything they wanted at any moment, it read. They do not need our cooperation, they merely enjoy it. A part of me had spent the drive over putting some serious mental distance between me and what I'd seen in the basement of that old bottling plant. But those words brought it all back like a rising tide that couldn't be stopped. Without wanting to, I retraced the memories, flashes of corpulent green and trembling white. A silhouette glimpsed in the tunnel. The face. Jeez, it was almost human. Do you want to come with me? The doctor was in the doorway. He didn't acknowledge the letter in my hand. Do I have a choice? I asked. Yes, he nodded, but not the one you think. I followed. I could give you a pill, he said as he walked ahead. A left turn, a right turn. He moved quickly through the hallways and downstairs. I felt like I was being led deeper into a maze. The clinic was huge. But what you really need is perspective. A small room, a metal door as thick as my arm. It was only when the doctor hauled it open with both hands and ice-cold air washed over me that I realized the room beyond was a walk-in freezer. It looked like it was full of some kind of bodysuits, maybe like the ones the hazmat guys wear. But then I saw the faces. Eyeless, distorted, pale. They glared at me from the shadows. I found my feet rooted to the spot and a wave of panic washed over me. Don't worry, they're just things. The doctor hit the light and I saw him smiling inside the freezer. On either side of him were rows of what looked like Halloween costumes, rubbery sheets of human skin dangling in loose outlines of the human form, shapeless and empty. There were many different faces among the racks, old and young, an array of people laid out like appetizers. One of them had feet that didn't reach as far as the rest. A child. Marriage is tough, he said as he ran a finger across one of the racks. I cringed at the sight of those things in motion. I'm surprised Persephone bothered with it, given her station. Carefully, like a tailor, he took one of the suits off the rack and held it up for me. Don't look away. His words were impossible to ignore. I examined the front of the suit. A woman in her 20s perhaps. It was hard to tell. She had a small scar on her chest, blemishes on her arms and face, a ring of blood scabbed around each eye. Once the doctor was satisfied that I'd gotten a good look, he turned the suit around and I saw a slit in the skin that began at the nape of the neck and ended at the coccyx. The knowledge required to fit something as large as a van into a space this small. He slid a finger into the hole and held it open for me to see the crimson underside of flayed skin. Is 1,000 years ahead of you. But to us, it's as primitive as rope. My mouth went dry. I felt parts of me loosen. Without really changing, the doctor's features took on an unusual expression. I suddenly became aware that I was looking at a bad costume, and I got the strangest sensation that he had far too many vertebrae. Persephone has asked that you remain unharmed," he said with a mouth that dripped tar. "But deals are not made by proxy, and she doesn't have the authority to speak on either our behalf or yours. Her value to us is clear. We use her family's assets to siphon meat, skin and pain from your rancid world. Why would we ever extend the same protections to you that we do to her, especially now that you've gone sniffing around our business?" A halo of darkness extending around the doctor, his human form dissolving into shadow until only eyes and a mouth remain, like some psychotic Cheshire cat. I took a few steps back and felt the door behind me. It was half open. I found myself wondering if I was quick enough to do it, if I was ready to test myself against this living ink blot that hurt just to look at. "That question, by the way," he said with a voice like grinding rock, "wasn't rhetorical." I turned and slammed the freezer door and locked it from the outside. I stumbled backwards and expected to hear the monster raging against the door. But there was only laughter. The clinic was bigger on the inside than the outside. Endless corridors and rooms, cold steel slabs, tables with sharp instruments that hurt just to look at. The place was mostly empty, but occasionally I would catch sight of a passing shadow or hear approaching footfalls, and I would be forced to duck into the same room and hide. Furtive peeks revealed nurses and orderlies wandering past with the casual boredom of someone at work. They looked human, but I couldn't bring myself to trust them. Everything in that place had an air of the sinister about it. The rooms didn't help. One of them was like a kennel, rows and rows of dog crates all lined up. I didn't think for even a second they ever once held dogs. Packs of crayons stuffed into the bars made that much clear. But I didn't have time to dwell too long on any of this. I hadn't forgotten the doctor. He was surely coming after me, and I hadn't forgotten his question. For the first time since the day began, I found myself hoping to see my wife. Whatever twisted game she'd organized for me, whatever sick and inhuman conspiracy she was embroiled in, she might at least offer some slither of protection. "Those that dwell in the dark love you." The same words as the factory, only this time they were engraved in a brass plaque and bolted to a door. I pushed past it and looked inside, desperate to retrace my steps out of that damn place. A morgue, or at least some analogue. Rows and rows of metal drawers for old cadavers. In the center, a steel table with straps for the ankles and wrists. From behind, I heard muffled voices and struggling feet. A young woman was sobbing. Two orderlies dragged her by the wrists, nowhere to run or hide. It was sheer luck that the man never looked up, too focused on keeping their quarry in tow. I had no choice but to enter the room and begin looking for a hiding place. Meanwhile, their footsteps and the woman's hysterical sobbing continued to get louder, and I realized with a dreadful lurch of the stomach that they were making for the room I was in. Desperation gave me an idea. I opened one of the metal drawers and saw a pair of skinless feet glaring back at me. Damn. I tried another and another, until at last I found one empty. I pulled it open and climbed on top, suppressing a reflexive gag as my mind took notice of the foul-smelling fluid that had pooled along the bottom. This drawer was only recently vacated, I realized, but there was no time to look further. I climbed inside, slid into the coffin-like darkness, and then pulled the hatch as close as I could without it actually clicking shut. Just in time, the door swung open and the men dragged the woman into the room and, with little effort, strapped her in. Her screaming only subsided when they left. In a way, I was lucky, because when I finally opened the drawer and climbed out, her renewed shrieks didn't seem to bother anyone and drew no attention. I couldn't blame her for damn nearly losing her mind. She was living through a nightmare, and the sight of a morgue drawer slowly opening and a body climbing out must have come close to pushing her completely over the edge. I ran over and begged her to be quiet. I told her I was stuck inside just like her. She didn't believe me at first, I think, or at least she didn't stop crying and shouting for help. Not even when I unstrapped her. I had to fight her to stop her making a run for the doors. "They'll catch you," I hissed in a whisper. "You have to be quiet or they'll come." She didn't manage a response. Both of us were shocked into silence by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. When I opened the drawer, she was lying there, eyes shut and finally quiet. For the first time since I'd seen her, she was no longer sobbing or screaming. The sound of her captors raising the alarm and running out of the room must have helped her realize this wasn't some strange ploy. I genuinely helped avoid a grim fate. "Thank you," she stammered as I guided her off the metal slab. A quick glance at my ruined clothes and she whispered, as an afterthought, "I'm sorry." It had turned out there was only one empty drawer, and out of pity, I let her take it. That had left me one of the occupied slabs, where I'd been forced to crawl on top of its occupant and wait there, breath held, as its rotten fluids soaked into my clothes. "Let's just get the hell out of here," I replied. "I think I know a way," she said. I asked her what that was, but instead she grabbed my hand and led me out of the corridor and down another. With some trepidation and double backing, she eventually found yet another cold-looking room filled with desks and chairs. "I tried this last time," she said, while pointing to a window high in the ceiling, "but I couldn't reach it on my own. Do you think you could give me a boost?" I didn't even bother answering. I grabbed a hole punch of the desk and had used it to break the window. I then knelt down and knitted my fingers together for her to stand on. She was halfway up with her head and shoulders through the window when I smelled it. Rotting, ancient. Behind us, the door creaked open and there was a sound of uneven feet limping across the floor. The woman hadn't seen. She didn't know. She just kept asking me to give her a push, and as the seconds dragged on and I failed to help her, her words and voice became increasingly desperate. A hand on my shoulder, the doctor's voice. "It wasn't rhetorical," he said once more, and his words drowned out the sound of the woman's screams as she turned and caught a glimpse of the thing behind me. "Why should we extend any protection to you?" My front door. It was night time. Beside me stood the young woman from the clinic. When she smiled, it was with too many teeth and blood that seeped from the gums. She pressed the doorbell a second time, and it swung open. My wife, an earnest smile. Despite everything, she looked homely. "Doctor," she said with a nod. "Persephone." That voice coming from a young and feminine face was unsettling. The doctor was rubbing my face in it. He wore the woman's skin with savage joy. They had made me watch him take it. The doctor shoved me through the door and I stumbled inside. I heard a few quiet words exchanged between my wife and that thing, and then the door was shut and she was standing over me with one eyebrow raised. "Tough day?" she asked. I could only shiver in response. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." "They've been agitating after you for a while," she said as she dried me off. She was gentle with the towel, a kindness I don't think I deserve. They enjoy difficult decisions. I'm thankful you made the right one. "Are you human?" I asked. "Mostly," she answered, "at least where it counts. Over time, you'll become like me, but we'll never be anything like them. We're just emissaries, I suppose, a halfway point." "Do you love me?" "Of course," she smiled. Why else would I ask that you be given a choice in this matter? I didn't have to. I didn't have to buy a building and fill it with people just so you could go to work every day and feel fulfilled either. Didn't have to pull strings to get your father on the transplant list after his accident last year. Didn't have to ensure your sister's unpleasant boyfriend met an even more unpleasant end. I've always looked after you, and I was right to. The choice you made today, it was one thing to save your skin by offering up the woman. That was inevitable, really. But what you've given up for me, that was touching. I remembered the doctor's words, wet and dripping, his voice seething with sadism. You could have your wife's position, he told me, and all that it bestows. But we don't need 2 caretakers for such a regional empire. She would be redundant. Offer her to us and show us that you are better suited for the role that she enjoys. It is either that or you will have to find another offering. It won't be half as easy, and the reward won't be half as great. We need to find a child, I said. Not just any child, she replied, before suddenly bursting into smile and tears. Oh, thank you, she cried as she hugged me. You could have chosen to give them me instead. It would have been easier, so much easier. And this way, I know that you really do love me. I promise you, in the long run, it'll be worth it. I couldn't bring myself to look into her eyes. Now, are you ready for the final secret? She asked. She handed me the envelope, and I opened it with wet, shaking hands. I am 2 months pregnant. They like toddlers, she said. The child must be old enough to have some semblance of a personality. They need to understand what is happening to them. We will have to wait until they're at least 3 years old before we hand... She kept talking, as something inside of me died. My eyes stung with dry pain, and I rubbed them with my palms, trying to massage the last bit of moisture into them from the insides of my eyelids. Like wringing out a sponge that's been sitting in the desert sun, there was little benefit. Still, I continued to stare at the computer screen in my home office, waiting for the final calculations to finish. If I was right about this, the dark silhouette of a planet I'd been staring at for the last 2 days really was capable of harboring life, maybe even intelligent life. The thought seemed surreal and dreamlike, further evidence of my exhausted state. It couldn't really be happening. It just wasn't possible. Was it? A second later, and the status bar showed complete, and the calculations were finally done. I began to read through the results, showing temperature variations and percentages of various compounds. Reading down from the top, my heart began to hammer faster and faster in my chest. Nitrogen, 78%. Oxygen, 20.9%. Argon, 0.9%. Carbon dioxide, 0.03%. Additional gases, see further breakdown below, 0.17%. Median temperature, 58.43 degrees Fahrenheit. It was impossible. The composition of the atmosphere, the temperature, the size of the planet, and its proximity to its star was just so happened to be a G-type yellow dwarf main sequence star. All of these features, they were identical to Earth, which meant I discovered the one planet every astronomer had dreamed of finding. The unicorn, the Goldilocks, the twin to our one-of-a-kind blue speck in the middle of the impossibly vast ocean that is space. If there was one place among the stars that could harbor intelligent life, this was it. I sent an email to my superiors telling them what I discovered, but it bounced back, saying undeliverable. After several more attempts, I tried calling, but the line was always busy, no matter who I dialed. Frustrated and exhausted, I decided to wait until morning. The cell service in the area of Hawaii was notoriously terrible, so I tried from a landline the next day. I hadn't slept in 48 hours, and it was all catching up with me at once, as my eyelids grew heavy and I wandered into the bedroom, collapsing onto the mattress. I fell asleep a second after my head hit the pillow, and I drifted into a deep sleep filled with mysterious dreams of lost stars and hidden planets. I awoke to the sight of a bright, bluish-white light. It glared at me from the end of my bed, an opening like a giant mouth. A silhouette emerged from the light, and then another. Just like the planet I had been watching through the telescope for so long, the figures blocked out a portion of that light, but only momentarily. And then there were hands roughly grabbing me and yanking me up from the warmth of my bed, pulling me across the floor with my feet dragging abrasively along the rough carpeting. "Hey, what are you doing? Where are you taking me?" I shouted, thrashing as I came back to alert wakefulness. They said nothing, only gripping me tighter as we drew closer to the blue, swirling vortex of glowing light. We went into the portal, and I felt extremely warm, then extremely cold, but only for a brief moment until we came out the other side. 2 robed figures stood before me, and I saw that we were on a rooftop overlooking a vast city. The buildings were towering, their features angular and sharp. Their highly reflective surfaces were tinged pink and blue, and I suddenly realized why they looked so bizarre. We're there, aren't we, on the planet I just discovered? The figures standing before me didn't say anything. They only stared blankly at me. As I observed the foreign planet in wonderment, I saw that the aliens who lived here were far more advanced than humans on Earth. This looked like a city from Star Wars. Floating spacecrafts docked and took off from ports built into massive skyscrapers. These gargantuan towers extended thousands of feet into the air, disappearing into the clouds above. Floating spacecraft of all sizes and shapes were traveling throughout the city, alighting on these docks like bees pollinating flowers. "How did you know I found you?" I asked. "Can you even understand me?" They didn't answer. "You must be able to understand me if you could read my emails and intercept them. Why didn't you want my superiors to know about this place?" Without responding, the taller of the 2 hooded figures nodded down to the streets far below us. I looked over the precipice and saw activity beneath us. A city full of life and aliens going about their day-to-day business. I couldn't make out much detail through the haze of the smog, but it looked dim and dreary down below. There was a noise and a flash of light, and we were suddenly standing there at street level. The aliens had advanced technology that allowed us to teleport through space in an instant, and they deployed it readily, it seemed. No walking around for these creatures, no elevators or stairs either. Vehicles which hovered above the ground at various levels packed the open air above the street. I looked up and saw that despite the added third dimension being employed to ease congestion, the traffic jams were still occurring. Each level of flying cars was honking, and there were creatures leaning out of the windows of the vehicles, barking in an alien tongue and gesturing with tentacles covered in fish-hook claws on one side. Street vendors were selling paper plates filled with foul-smelling meat to customers who had lined up to purchase lunch. A dozen or more were standing near us, and I was careful to stay close to the hooded figures who were acting as my guides. The creatures of this planet were tall, wide and gelatinous. They had proboscises instead of mouths and tentacles instead of arms and legs, which they used to propel themselves, similar to how octopuses move in a myriad of different ways. Some of them walked on their back tentacles, almost like bipedal humans, while others slithered and moved snake-like across the pavement. They also changed colours, I noticed, depending on the background behind them. Surprisingly, none of them seemed to notice as the 3 of us stood, watching them silently from a shaded spot near a building. The hooded figure standing next to me raised an extremity which was shrouded in robes. I looked where they were pointing and saw something very odd. A man was coming out of the sewer grate in the middle of the street. Hovering cars were honking at him and splashing him with mud as they sped past. He seemed to not notice. His face was calm and passive, and there was a collar around his neck, covered in blinking lights. "What the hell?" I muttered, watching him go about his duties, but was bringing buckets of brown, slimy muck up from the sewers. His face and clothing were smeared with it, and I could smell the disgusting stench from where we stood, at least 30 yards away. "Why is there a person here?" I asked the hooded figures. "There can't be a person here. We're further away from Earth than any spacecraft is capable of traveling, assuming we are where I think we are." Then, a moment later, we teleported again. We were no longer on street level, but instead we were far below the ground, in a dark mine. The sound of pickaxes, chisels and hammers could be heard over the cacophony of voices and minecarts which travelled across nearby rails. The voices were human, I realised, and we drew closer to see a group of men working at the walls with crude tools. Each one had that same collar covered in blinking lights snugly secured around their necks. They were the same collars as the one I'd seen the man wearing up on street level. Their faces were calm and passive, none of them looking angry or upset. Instead, they wore no expression at all. As they loaded up mine carts full of rock material, I saw that once they were full, they would send them off down the tracks. More carts would come to take their place, and they would fill those up, sending them off down the track as well, in a never-ending monotony of movement. The men and women worked tirelessly, and none of them stopped for an instant to rest. I looked at my guides, beginning to grow angry. "What is this place? What are you doing to these people?" The hooded figures looked at each other and nodded, then turned back to me and revealed their faces. My guides were human, but they looked different, battle-scarred and branded with strange numeric tattoos and barcodes which covered their skin. The one on the left was a man, the other a woman. Both had shaved heads and brown eyes. "We needed to show you what would happen if you contact your superiors about this planet. If we didn't, then this timeline would become prime. Trust me, you don't want that." I looked back and forth between their unreadable faces, then again at the hordes of human servants being forced by giant aliens into servitude. I was terrified, but the scientist in me needed to know what all of this meant. And I'll admit, looking back, my pride was badly wounded just thinking about denouncing my findings. They were huge. I discovered another planet capable of supporting life in the most optimal conditions imaginable. Not only that, but there actually was life on this planet. "What are you saying? I can't tell anyone about my findings or else this will happen? Let me guess, this is a simulation or a hallucination or something like that, right? This isn't even real?" "This is very real. This is the future if you choose to continue on the path you have chosen. Despite what you may think, this will come to pass within your lifetime if you do not follow what we tell you." I thought about this for a minute. I can't keep this discovery to myself. I just can't. I live by a code as a scientist, and I cannot break that code. I can't just keep something like this a secret. But don't worry, we won't try to contact this other planet. We'll just observe it. I'll be sure of that. The man turned to look at the woman. "You were right. He's too stupid to save. No matter what we do, he'll tell them what he found." She sighed. "I regret to say that you're right. We'll have to leave him here." She snapped her fingers, and I noticed that a slight hissing sound which had been surrounding me without my notice was suddenly gone. Like when the power goes out and you realize how quiet it is without the fridge running. The aliens and all of the humans nearby turned to look at me, and I realized they could see me now. "He's trying to escape," one of the men nearby said, blandly, with no emotion. His collar blinked yellow, then green, making a pleasant chiming noise. His eyes rolled back in his head as if he had just received a boost of dopamine to his brain. "I'll stop him," a woman near me said, reaching out to grab hold of me. He is tall and looks strong. He'll be a good worker for the mines. I pulled away from her, and several others started moving in towards me from all around. "Help, please. I won't say anything. Just let me go back. I want to go back," I screamed, trying to get back into the faint, hazy blue bubble surrounding my hosts. The people who had brought me to this place could no longer be seen inside, but I imagined them shaking their heads. "I'll tell them that this planet is a wasteland, uninhabitable. Please, just let me go back." They seemed to consider this. After a few long moments, just as the dirty hands of the mining prisoners all around me were about to grab a hold of me, they pulled me back into the protective bubble of invisibility. Once I was back inside, they looked at me sternly, and the woman began to speak. "We are from the future, even past this one, when humans stand up against their captive overlords and begin to fight back. Unfortunately, we are outnumbered and outgunned. However, we have managed to gain one advantage. A mission to capture several pieces of enemy technology allowed us this one opportunity, this one chance to go back in time and fix things. Now that you have seen it firsthand, you must understand why you cannot share your findings about this planet with anyone for as long as you live. You must keep this place a secret," the man said gravely. "I will. I can see now that this is real, and that you're trying to protect us from contacting these creatures for a reason," I said, too terrified to argue with him. "We all talked about this possibility amongst each other in the break room, in the lab, around the computers while looking at images of planets we discovered. The question was on all our minds. What if we find intelligent life? But it turns out they're much more advanced. What if they're a super predator, and they don't want to share this universe with anyone else? That is exactly why you must keep this a secret. I repeat, you cannot tell anyone about your discovery. If you do, this is what will come of the human race. We will live in chains for 100 years, and perhaps much longer." He snapped his fingers, and I woke up to find myself back in bed, in my home once again. It was morning, and birds were chirping outside my window. The possibility occurred to me that all of this could have been a nightmare. It felt so real, I thought to myself. But still, my discovery was too big to ignore. I couldn't just let it go to waste. I went over to my desk again and looked at the unsent email from the night prior, which I tried to send to my boss. The coordinates of the planet and the makeup of his atmosphere, so similar to Earth. It was all right there, waiting to be seen. I couldn't help myself. I hit the send button. I know some of you will be upset with me, but you don't understand. This discovery is going to be huge. It's going to change the world. It's going to change everything.